Hello story enthusiasts. Welcome to Vision Harry. Today we venture into Petunia left Vernon and took Harry to the Leaky Cauldron at midnight. She never went back. Your support means everything. Like and subscribe. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The door she opened. The letter was written in purple ink. Petunia had found it on the doorstep at 6:30 in the morning, tucked beneath a sleeping infant she had absolutely no intention of keeping, and she had read it 3 times standing in the open doorway with the November cold pouring in around her ankles before Vernon's snoring from upstairs reminded her to close the door. She'd sat at the kitchen table with the baby on the counter beside her, propped against the backsplash, wrapped in something soft and green that was not, she noted, anything she had bought, and she'd read the letter a 4th time. And a 5th. The purple ink caught the kitchen light in a way that regular ink did not. She told herself it was just a trick of the fluorescence. The letter explained, in terms both grand and clinical, that her sister was dead. Petunia already knew this. She'd known it the way you know a storm is coming before you open the curtains, a wrongness in the air, a pressure behind her eyes she'd felt since yesterday evening and hadn't been able to explain to Vernon, who had looked at her strangely over supper and asked if she was coming down with something. She hadn't answered. She hadn't known how. Lily was dead. James Potter was dead. And this was their son. The baby on the counter, Harry, the letter called him, Harry James Potter, had woken up at some point during Petunia's 3rd reading and was now watching her with a focused, unnervingly calm attention that no infant she'd ever encountered was capable of. Dudley, at that age, had communicated exclusively through screaming. This child was simply looking at her, as though he were waiting for her to arrive at whatever conclusion he'd already reached. He had Lily's eyes. Green. Not just green, a specific, irreplicable green that Petunia had spent 30 years trying to forget, the green of the small patch of garden behind their childhood home where Lily had first done something impossible and laughed about it while Petunia stood at the back door with her fists clenched, furious and terrified and so jealous it lived in her like a second heartbeat. She set the letter down. She thought about Vernon, asleep upstairs. About Dudley in his crib. About the life she had built on the principle of being the normal one, the sensible one, the one who hadn't gone chasing impossible things and gotten herself killed for it at 21. She thought about Lily at 7 years old, making flower petals change color in the palm of her hand and laughing, like it was the simplest joy in the world. She thought about the last letter Lily had ever sent her, which Petunia had not answered. The baby, Harry, reached up with one small hand and closed his fist around a strand of air, and the overhead light flickered once, warm and gold, just for a second. Petunia pressed her fingers against her mouth. Then she stood up. She moved through the house with the methodical efficiency of someone who has made a decision and intends to act on it before her nerve fails. She did not go upstairs. She did not wake Vernon. She went to the hallway cupboard instead and pulled out the holdall she used for weekends away, opened it on the kitchen floor, and began packing with the focused calm of someone defusing something. Nappies. Spare clothes for the baby. She had Dudley's old things still boxed in the garage and she grabbed a stack without looking at the sizes, some of them too large, some of them fine. Formula. The tin of powdered milk from the back of the pantry. A bottle. 2 bottles. She moved fast. The baby watched her from the counter and made no noise. She paused in the middle of the kitchen. The letter was still on the table. She picked it up and read the final paragraph one more time. I ask that you raise the boy as your own, and trust in my judgment that this arrangement serves both his welfare and the greater good. The protections placed upon your home will keep him safe as long as he may call it home. I trust you will see the wisdom in this. Yours, Albus Dumbledore. Trust in my judgment. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She had no idea who Albus Dumbledore thought she was, but she was quite certain he had never actually met her. Because anyone who had met Petunia Evans, Dursley, she corrected herself, except that name felt different tonight, felt like a costume she might simply choose to take off, would have known better than to tell her to trust his judgment and expect compliance. Lily had trusted people's judgment. Lily was dead. She picked up Harry, settled him against her shoulder, picked up the holdall with her other hand, and walked out the front door of number 4, Privet Drive at 10 minutes to midnight. The November air was bitter. She'd grabbed her heavy winter coat, and she bundled it around Harry as best she could, his small face against her neck, warm and startlingly alive. She stood on the front step for a moment, the door opened behind her, the yellow hall light falling out across the garden path. She thought about going back in. She thought about Lily's face. The last time she'd seen it in person, not the terrible, specific way she'd imagined it since yesterday, but the last real time, 5 years ago now, when Lily had come round with James and a bottle of wine and a peace offering wrapped in tissue paper, and Petunia had watched them from the upstairs window and told Vernon she wasn't home. She pulled the door shut behind her. She didn't lock it. Vernon had a key. She walked. The problem was that she had no particular destination. She knew, in the abstract, that there was a wizarding world existing somewhere underneath and alongside the ordinary one. Lily had told her things over the years, before Petunia had started refusing to listen. She knew the name Diagon Alley. She knew the name Hogsmeade. She knew that there was, somewhere in London, a pub called the Leaky Cauldron that served as a sort of gateway, a threshold between the two worlds, and she knew this because Lily had written her a letter from there, 11 years ago, on the first day of autumn term, bubbling over with excitement about starting school, and Petunia had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She still had it. It was in a box under the bed in the spare room. She had no idea where the Leaky Cauldron was relative to where she was standing. She walked to the end of Privet Drive, turned right on instinct, and started moving in the direction of the town centre with a baby strapped to her chest and a holdall over her shoulder. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday in November. The streets were empty. Her footsteps were very loud. Harry fell asleep somewhere between the end of Privet Drive and the roundabout on Magnolia Road, his breathing going slow and even against her collar. She adjusted her grip on the holdall and kept walking. She caught a bus into central London. The driver gave her an odd look, a woman alone at midnight with a sleeping infant and an overnight bag, but didn't say anything, and she paid her fare and sat at the back and stared out the window at the passing lights of the city and tried very hard not to think about what she was doing. She was doing the right thing. She was not sure who the right thing was for. But she was doing it. London at night was its own specific creature, loud in patches, silent in others, smelling of rain and diesel and something faintly burnt in the way all old cities smell faintly burnt. She got off near Charing Cross Road without entirely knowing why, just the sense that this was the right direction, the same wordless pull she'd always felt toward Lily's world and had spent years training herself to ignore. She stood on the pavement with the holdall on her shoulder and the baby against her chest and looked at the row of shops across the street. Most were dark. One was not. It was sandwiched between a music shop and a bookshop, and it was not the kind of place you'd notice if you weren't looking, a small, dingy establishment with a sign above the door that she almost couldn't read, as though her eyes kept sliding off it. She made herself focus. Made herself look directly at it. The Leaky Cauldron. She exhaled. Harry shifted against her shoulder and made a small noise, not waking, just adjusting. She crossed the street. The door was heavy oak, age-blackened, with a handle worn smooth by decades of hands. She put her palm flat against it for a moment. From inside she could hear the low murmur of voices. It was nearly midnight and apparently the wizarding world kept different hours than the ordinary one, and the sound of a fire. She pushed the door open and walked in. It was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. The room was low-ceilinged and warm, lit by candles and a fire that was burning green at its edges in a way that shouldn't have been possible but clearly was. The tables were heavy wood, the kind of furniture that looked like it had never been moved. The walls were hung with things she couldn't quite focus on, tapestries that seemed to shift if she looked at them sideways, portraits of people who moved when she didn't look directly at them. There were perhaps a dozen people scattered around the room at various tables, some talking, some drinking alone, some playing a card game she didn't recognize. None of them looked up when she came in. The bar was tended by a man she might have described as ancient if she had to put a word to it, though there was something about his stillness that made ancient feel imprecise. He was small and slight with a face mapped with wrinkles and eyes that were doing something complex in the candlelight. He was polishing a glass with a cloth that was, she was almost certain, polishing the glass more thoroughly than hands and cloth physics should allow. He looked up when she crossed the threshold. His eyes moved from her to the infant on her shoulder, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like someone who has made a calculation and arrived at an unexpected result. She walked to the bar because standing in the doorway was not going to solve anything. "I need a room," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "And I need someone to tell me what I'm supposed to do with him." She tilted her head to indicate Harry, though she suspected the barkeep already knew exactly who Harry was. The old man set down the glass he'd been polishing and leaned both hands on the bar and looked at her with the specific expression of someone taking a full account. "You're Petunia Desley," he said. It wasn't a question. "Petunia Evans," she said, surprising herself. "And you are?" "Tom," he said. "Just Tom. Kept this place for 40 years. He paused. "Lily Potter's sister." "Yes." "And that's, yes," she said again. Tom was quiet for a moment. He had very good stillness, the kind that wasn't blankness but rather a deep attentiveness. Then he reached under the bar and produced a key on a heavy iron ring. "Room's at the top of the stairs," he said. "First one on the left. It's the quiet one." He paused. "There's a warming charm on the blanket chest. Good for infants." She took the key. "I don't have any," she started. "Sort it out in the morning," Tom said, and the way he said it brooked no argument and also contained something that was almost, but not quite, kindness. "You've had a night." She had, rather. She was halfway to the stairs when he spoke again. "Miss Evans." She turned. "I'm sorry about your sister," Tom said. "She was a good woman. She came through here every September 1st for 7 years. Always said hello." Petunia's throat closed. "Thank you," she managed. She went upstairs. The room was small and smelled of wood smoke and something herbal, and the bed was a four-poster with curtains that were probably trying to be impressive and settled for being heavy and warm. She laid Harry down on the center of the bed and built a barricade of pillows around him without thinking about it, muscle memory from Dudley's early months, and then she sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed. Harry slept through all of it. She looked at him. He was, objectively, a very small person to have caused this much disruption. Round-faced in the way of all infants, dark tufts of hair going in directions hair wasn't supposed to go, a faint pink scar on his forehead in a shape that made her look away. He had his mother's eyes but she couldn't see them now, closed in sleep, and without them he was just a baby, just a child, just a small person who had already been abandoned once tonight by the universe's decision to kill his parents and once again by a very large and impressive wizard who had left him on a doorstep in November without so much as a knock. She thought, with sudden bright clarity, what she would have said to Dumbledore if he'd been standing in her kitchen when she found that letter. She thought it would have been quite a lot. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was sitting upright against the headboard with Harry curled in the crook of her arm, and she dreamed of nothing at all. In the morning, the wizarding world arrived in the form of a woman. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair cut short and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Petunia, incongruously, of the matron at her secondary school, competent in a way that didn't need announcing, which Petunia had always respected in people regardless of whether she liked them. She knocked on Petunia's door at 7:30 with a tray of breakfast and a directness of expression that suggested she'd already decided exactly how this conversation was going to go. "I'm Rowan Pomfrey," she said. "Tom sent me up. He thought you might have questions. May I come in?" Petunia, who had been awake since 6 and had spent the hour sitting at the small window watching Diagon Alley wake up and trying to compose herself, stepped aside. Pomfrey, she said, because the name tickled something. Is that, my cousin is the school matron at Hogwarts, Rowan said, setting the breakfast tray on the small table. Poppy. You'd have no reason to know her. She turned and looked at Harry, who was sitting propped against the pillow wall with absolute dignity, watching Rowan the way he'd watched Petunia in the kitchen, that focused, assessing attention. Well. He's all there, isn't he? He hasn't cried once, Petunia said, before she could decide whether she intended to say it. Interesting, Rowan said, though she didn't elaborate on what she found interesting about it. She pulled the single chair closer to the table, sat down, poured 2 cups of tea from the pot on the tray, and pushed one toward the edge of the table closest to where Petunia was standing. Sit down. You've made a very large decision and I suspect you'd like someone to help you understand what you've walked into. Petunia sat. I know more than you think, she said, not defensively, just establishing the baseline. Lily told me things. I ignored most of them. I know more than I let on, even to myself. She wrapped her hands around the teacup. I know what she died for. I know what he was. She didn't say the name. She wasn't sure she could yet. I know there's a prophecy involved somehow, and I know my nephew is going to spend his whole life being pointed at it. Rowan regarded her with something that shifted toward respect. That's rather more than most muggles know. I'm not most muggles, Petunia said. There was no arrogance in it, just fact. No, Rowan agreed. I don't suppose you are. They drank their tea. Harry made a small noise and Petunia reached over without looking and adjusted the pillow nearest him, and he subsided, apparently satisfied. Dumbledore will try to get him back, Petunia said. Certainly. The blood protection, he mentioned it in the letter. It only works if Harry lives with me. In a home I can call mine. That's broadly correct, Rowan said. Though the specifics are a little more nuanced than Dumbledore tends to communicate. She cradled her cup. The protection is blood-based, your sister's sacrifice. You share blood with Lily. As long as you love the boy, the protection holds. As long as I love him, Petunia repeated. Yes. That's not conditional on where we live. Rowan looked at her steadily. It's conditional on family. On genuine care. The location is Dumbledore's interpretation, and he is not, whatever he believes, infallible. She paused. There's a reason the original magic doesn't specify an address. Something loosened in Petunia's chest. Tell me the rest, she said. Rowan stayed until noon. She explained things the way a good teacher explains, not dumbing down, not showing off, just building information in useful sequence. Petunia asked questions that made Rowan pause occasionally, recalibrate, answer more precisely. She had always been good at extracting information from people, it was a skill that had served her at every point in her life except the one where she'd needed it most and chosen silence instead. She learned about Diagon Alley, its layout, its commerce, its social dynamics. She learned about the Ministry of Magic and its particular combination of bureaucratic inertia and tribal panic. She learned about Hogwarts in terms of its actual function, not the glowing mythologized version Lily had described but the institutional reality, the houses, the politics between them, the way certain names opened certain doors. She learned that Sirius Black, James Potter's best friend, Harry's named godfather, was in Azkaban. He betrayed them, Rowan said, and something carefully neutral in her tone made Petunia look up from her tea. You don't believe that, Petunia said. Rowan was quiet. You've heard something, Petunia said. Or you know something. Or you simply think it doesn't add up. She watched the older woman's face. Lily wrote to me about Sirius Black. In one of the letters I didn't answer. She said, she stopped. She was not going to cry in front of this woman she had known for 4 hours. She said he was the most loyal person she'd ever met. She said Harry loved him. She said if anything ever happened to her, she wanted Harry with Sirius. There was no trial, Rowan said finally. The careful neutrality had been replaced by something harder and quieter. They sent him directly to Azkaban. Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper, blown up in the street, they said. Sirius killed him and 12 muggles. Nothing left but a finger. She looked at Harry. A finger. In the street. That's what they accepted. Petunia filed this information away. It went into a specific drawer in her mind, a drawer labeled "Deal with this rather than think about this later," because later had been the instruction she'd given herself about Lily for 10 years and she knew exactly what later meant. What would happen, she said, if someone with access to the right channels made a formal request for a case review? Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Eventually, she said, it would either be rejected outright or it would go before the Wisengamot. The Ministry would fight it. The case is closed and reopening it would require admitting that someone, possibly several someones, had made a catastrophic error. She paused. It would also require evidence. Or veritaserum administered to the accused. The accused is in Azkaban. The accused is in Azkaban now, Petunia said. Harry is 15 months old. I have time. Rowan looked at her for a long, considering moment. Then she did something that surprised Petunia entirely. She smiled. Not warmly, not sentimentally, but with the specific satisfaction of someone who has underestimated a situation and is pleased to have been corrected. You're going to be quite something, Rowan said. I was always quite something, Petunia said. I simply applied it in the wrong direction. The weeks that followed were the hardest Petunia could remember since the weeks after her parents died, and they were hard in a completely different way, not grief-shaped but adjustment-shaped, the constant pressure of learning a new world while keeping a small human alive inside it. Tom gave her the room indefinitely. He was not sentimental about it. When she tried to discuss terms on the second morning, he'd listened to her precisely laid-out proposal, access to domestic space in exchange for maintaining the pub's accounts and stock records, which she had already determined were a catastrophe, and then he'd looked at Harry, who was at that point sitting in the bar's safest corner in a padded crate they'd improvised from a wine box and an old pub blanket, watching the morning regulars with great interest, and he'd said, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the books. The room's yours. He'd gone back to wiping the bar. Negotiation complete. She was grateful for his directness. The wizarding world was full of people who talked around things, who communicated in suggestions and implications and formal courtesies that took twice as long to say half as much. Tom said what he meant, and he meant what he was willing to follow through on, and Petunia found this profoundly refreshing. She opened a Gringotts account. The goblins were, she had been warned, difficult. They were not difficult with her. She suspected it was because she treated them the way she treated anyone in a position of institutional power, with absolute precision of language, zero attempts at charm, and a clear sense of exactly what she was asking for and why. The account was opened in under 30 minutes and the goblin on duty, Sharpclaw, who Rowan had indicated was notably prickly with wizarding clients, gave her what she recognized as a professional nod on her way out. She wired Vernon from a phone box on the Muggle side of Charing Cross Road on the fourth morning. The conversation was brief. Vernon wanted to know where she was. Vernon wanted to know what she was playing at. Vernon told her she was being hysterical and that she needed to come home immediately and that she could not seriously intend to keep the boy because he was not normal and Vernon would not have it. He had told her, he would not have it in his house. He's not in your house, Petunia said. And he won't be. Goodbye, Vernon. She hung up before he could respond. She stood in the phone box for a moment, her hand still on the receiver. Then she straightened her coat, picked up Harry from the sling she'd jury-rigged from a scarf, and walked back toward the Leaky Cauldron. Vernon did not call again for 3 weeks. When he did, it was to inform her that he intended to file for divorce. Petunia said that was entirely his prerogative and gave him the name of a solicitor she'd looked up for him because she'd known him well enough to know he wouldn't have thought to do it himself. That was the end of Petunia Desley. She went back to Evans the same day. Harry did something extraordinary on the 6th of December, when he was 7 weeks old. He was sitting in the padded crate. He'd outgrown the wine box and Tom had located an actual padded infant seat from somewhere, the origin of which Petunia had decided not to investigate, in the corner of the bar on a quiet afternoon when the fire was going and there were perhaps 3 other people in the room and the grey December light was coming through the small windows. Petunia was at the bar with a ledger and a cup of tea, doing what had become her standard Tuesday arrangement with Tom's accounts. She heard a sound from Harry's corner. She looked up. He was laughing. That was the ordinary part. He was 7 weeks old, babies laughed. What was not ordinary was what else was happening. Every candle in the immediate vicinity of his corner, perhaps a dozen, in their various iron holders on the wall and the nearby tables, had bent toward him at a slight angle, their flames leaning in like they were listening. The light in that corner of the room was warm and doubled and gold in a way that had nothing to do with physics, and Harry was laughing at it with the complete, uncomplicated joy of someone experiencing something wonderful. One of the 3 other patrons was watching him with an expression that moved through surprise, something else, and settled on a kind of careful reverence. "Extraordinary control for an infant," said the patron, a woman in deep blue robes, older, sharp-faced, with a small notebook open on the table in front of her. She was addressing no one in particular. "Wandless. Purely instinctive. And directional, he's not just emitting, he's pulling." "I beg your pardon," Petunia said. The woman looked at her. "You're the aunt." "I'm his family," Petunia said. "Who are you?" "Bathsheba Babbling," the woman said. "I teach at Hogwarts. Ancient runes. I come here on Tuesdays." "You were taking notes on my nephew." "I was noting a remarkable thing I observed," Babbling said, without particular apology but also without antagonism. "He's doing something I've seen precisely once before in my 30 years of teaching. And that child grew up to be," she stopped. She looked at Harry again. "Well. You know who he is." "Yes," Petunia said. "He's going to be extraordinary." "I know," Petunia said. This was not pride. It was not arrogance. It was simply a thing she had understood in the kitchen on Privet Drive the moment she'd watched the overhead light change color, and she had been quietly orienting herself around it ever since. "I intend to make sure he has what he needs to be extraordinary safely." Babbling looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed her notebook. "I teach Tuesday and Thursday afternoons during term. Hogwarts allows professors independent tutorials during school holidays with ministerial approval." She paused. "I could make a case, I think, that a child of this significance warrants early and structured magical theory education. The approval is a formality." "You would do that," Petunia said. It wasn't quite a question. "Lily Potter was my best student in 30 years, Babbling said simply. "The least I can do for her son is make sure someone teaches him to understand what he is." Harry, in his corner, had apparently tired of the candles and was now investigating his own fingers with equal fascination. The candles had gently returned to vertical. Petunia looked at the woman across from her. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons," she said. "He's 7 weeks old, so perhaps we begin with theory for now." "Indeed," said Babbling. "Theory first. Always theory first." She picked up her quill, opened a fresh page in her notebook, and wrote something across the top of it that Petunia couldn't read from the bar. Then she looked up and said, with complete seriousness, "You should also learn. If you're going to raise him, you should understand his world. Not as a visitor. As a resident." Petunia thought about every letter from Lily she'd filed away unread. Every visit she hadn't answered the door for. Every year she'd spent building a life shaped like an ordinary life and watching it from the inside with the persistent, specific grief of someone who had made their choice and couldn't unmake it. "Yes," she said. "I should." The first letter from Dumbledore arrived on a Friday, 13 days after she'd walked out of number 4. It was delivered by a large, imperious owl that landed on the bar and presented the letter with an air of carrying something vitally important. Tom looked at the owl. He looked at Petunia. He didn't say anything. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant and unhurried, the kind of script that announced its own confidence. The letter itself was, she'd admitted, in the privacy of her own head, beautifully composed. It was warm. It was kind. It acknowledged the shock of what had happened and expressed what seemed like genuine sorrow for Lily's death. And then, about halfway down the second page, it transitioned smoothly and inevitably into an explanation of why Harry needed to be at number 4, Privet Drive. The blood protection. The wards. The sacrifice made manifest. The safest place. The most important thing. I am sure you understand, it concluded, why this is necessary. I would be grateful if you could contact me at your earliest convenience so that we may arrange the boy's return. Petunia read it twice. Then she set it on the bar, picked up a candle from the nearest holder. She'd been practicing small things, not magic, just familiarity with the tools of this world, and held the letter's corner over the flame until it caught. Tom watched the letter burn. "He'll send another," he said. "I know," Petunia said. "And another after that." "I know." Tom nodded slowly. "What will you do when he comes in person?" She thought about this. "Invite him in," she said. "Give him tea. Listen to everything he says." She looked at Harry, who was sitting in his padded seat chewing the edge of a board book that Rowan had brought him, apparently deeply engaged in the project. "And then tell him no." Tom made a sound that, on a less weathered face, might have been a laugh. "You know," he said, "most people find Dumbledore rather difficult to say no to." "Most people," Petunia said, "were taught by the world that people like Dumbledore know best." She picked up her tea. "I was taught that by the world too. I was also taught that my sister's world was strange and dangerous and not for people like me, and that lesson killed her." She looked down at the ash of the letter on the bar top. "I'm done taking lessons from people who mean well." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Right," he said, and went back to his glasses. In the corner, Harry looked up from his board book, gazed at Petunia with those green eyes, and made a small sound of complete agreement. She picked him up. She held him, and he grabbed her collar in one small fist, and outside the narrow windows of the Leaky Cauldron the London evening was going dark and cold and full of ordinary people living their ordinary lives, and here inside this small, strange, insufficient place that was already becoming something like home, Petunia Evans held her sister's son and decided, quietly and without drama, that she was going to learn everything. All of it. Every rule of this world, every gap in those rules, every piece of power that came in forms other than a wand and a spell. She was going to learn what Harry was, and what he needed, and what the world intended to do with him, and she was going to stand between him and every version of that plan that didn't put his welfare first. Dumbledore had written his letter in purple ink and signed it with the assumption that she would obey. She had burned it. She would burn the next one too, if she had to. And the one after that. But she hoped, with the practical efficiency of someone who preferred not to waste energy on the same problem twice, that eventually Albus Dumbledore would come to understand that Petunia Evans was not an obstacle between Harry Potter and the world. She was the door. And she had already decided what got through it and what did not. Harry patted her cheek with one open hand, very deliberately, like punctuation. She pressed her face briefly against his dark, chaotic hair. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's get on with it, then." Chapter 2. A room above the world. 3 years was long enough to learn a city inside out, if you paid the right kind of attention. Petunia had always paid the right kind of attention. It was, perhaps, the one trait she'd inherited directly from her mother, that particular female alertness, the constant low-level cataloging of environment and personnel and potential threat, which her mother had applied to church committees and neighborhood gossip and which Petunia had applied, first to the business of being Vernon Dursley's wife, and now to the business of surviving in a world that ran on rules she hadn't been born into. She knew Diagon Alley the way she knew her own hands. She knew which vendors were honest and which were optimistic about their product descriptions. She knew that Madame Malkin's alterations girl, a quiet muggle-born named Sarah who'd left Hogwarts 3 years ago and was frankly too talented to be hemming school robes, was reliable and discreet and would tell you things about wizarding fashion politics that you'd never find in a book. She knew that the second-hand section at Flourish and Blots was poorly organized in a way that rewarded patience, and that if you spent 20 minutes on a Thursday you could reliably find first editions misfiled under general interest. She knew which of the Gringotts tellers had been promoted recently and would therefore be unusually helpful, and she knew that the tea Madame Pomfrey, Rowan, who had become simply Rowan over the course of 3 years and several hundred cups of tea, made on Tuesday mornings was strong enough to stand a spoon in and was the single best thing in the wizarding world, possibly including magic. She knew all of this because she had paid attention. Because she had made herself useful before she made herself noticed, and made herself noticed before she made herself a fixture, and she was now, at 34, a fixture. Not famous. Not particularly powerful in the conventional sense. But present in a way that mattered, in the way that someone who does the unsexy, essential work always matters, the accounts kept, the records accurate, the small crises of paperwork navigated before they became large crises of policy. Tom's books had been only the beginning. She now managed accounts for 7 businesses in Diagon Alley, consulting for 3 others on what she'd come to think of as infrastructure problems, the gap between what magical people were brilliant at and what they were catastrophically bad at, which turned out to be almost everything involving precision record-keeping, consistent process documentation, and the concept of financial forecasting. Wizards, she had discovered, were remarkably creative about solving immediate problems and remarkably resistant to the idea that problems could be anticipated before they arrived. This was the gap she had walked into, and she had filled it with the focused intensity of someone who had spent a decade in domestic management and discovered that domestic management was, in fact, project management with worse pay and no title. She had money now. Not abundant wealth, nothing like what she'd been used to with Vernon's income, but her own money, earned by her own capability, held in her own Gringotts account, and it had a different weight entirely. It sat differently in her chest than Vernon's money ever had. Harry was 4 years old and the most interesting person she had ever met. He was in the middle of the bar when she came downstairs on a Tuesday morning, sitting cross-legged on the flagstones near the fire with a book open on his knees and an expression of deep concentration that would have looked entirely at home on a much older person. He was wearing the green jumper that Rowan had knitted him for his birthday, which had already acquired a suspicious brown stain on the left elbow and was missing one button. His hair was doing its usual thing, which was to say going in every direction simultaneously, and his glasses, he'd needed them since just before his 3rd birthday, small round ones that he took off constantly and then couldn't find, so Petunia had charmed them, with Babbling's help, to a small alert spell that made them vibrate gently when he called for them, were slightly crooked on his face. He looked up when she reached the bottom of the stairs. "There's a man outside," he said. "Good morning to you too," she said. "Good morning," he said, with the specific tone of someone completing a formality under protest. "There's a man outside. He's been standing there for 12 minutes. He keeps looking at the door." Petunia looked at Tom, who was behind the bar doing something with a cloth that he'd been doing with various cloths for 3 years and which she now understood was less about cleanliness and more about having something to occupy his hands when he was thinking. "Arrived about 7:45, Tom said. "Didn't come in." Petunia went to the small window beside the door and looked out. The man was perhaps 40, or perhaps much older. He had the look of someone who had been a certain age for a very long time and wasn't doing it particularly well, which was less about physical appearance and more about the specific quality of his stillness. He was wearing robes that were neat but not new, and he was standing on the pavement outside with his hands in his pockets and his face turned slightly toward the door, like someone who had decided to come in and then thought better of it and was now reconsidering the reconsideration. He had the bearing, Petunia thought, of someone who had been very good at a very hard thing for a very long time and was currently not doing that hard thing, and the absence of it had changed his posture in ways he hadn't noticed. She opened the door. He looked up, startled. "If you're going to come in," she said, "come in. It's November." He blinked. Then, slowly, something in his expression settled from uncertainty into something closer to relief. He came in. Up close, he was all worn edges, careful beard, careful eyes, a quality of guardedness that she recognized because she'd worn it herself for about a decade. He smelled faintly of old books and something else, outdoorsy, that she couldn't name. He saw Harry. Harry looked up from his book. The man stopped moving entirely. Petunia watched this. She watched the man's face do something complex and involuntary, not a simple emotion but several emotions at once, fighting for expression and producing instead a very particular stillness that she knew, from personal experience, meant someone trying very hard not to cry in public. Harry tilted his head. He was studying the man the way he studied everything that interested him, with the complete focus of someone for whom attention was not polite performance but genuine engagement. "You knew my mum," Harry said. The man inhaled sharply. Yes. Yes, I did. And my dad. Yes. You're sad, Harry said. It wasn't accusatory, just observational, the way he said most things. That's all right. Petunia's sad sometimes about my mum and she doesn't always want to talk about it and I don't make her, but if you want to talk about them I want to know. He looked back at his book, then up again. I'm Harry. I know, the man said, almost a whisper. I'm Remus. Remus Lupin. Petunia's attention sharpened. She knew the name, not from personal memory but from the careful study she'd been doing since that first conversation with Rowan about Sirius Black. Remus Lupin, school friend, order member, close enough to James Potter that he'd been photographed beside him in every photograph from the later years of the war. Considered above suspicion because he had never been a suspect. And there was something else about him that she was currently noting with a professional lack of reaction, the yellowing at the collar, the particular pallor, the careful way he timed his visit to a Tuesday, which was 10 days from the last full moon. Sit down, she said. I'll get tea. He told her he'd been looking for them for 6 months. Not looking with any official intent, he was careful to clarify this, both hands wrapped around his teacup, just looking. Checking. He'd heard rumors in the wizarding community, as such communities were constitutionally incapable of containing rumors, that there was a muggle woman in Diagon Alley who was raising Harry Potter and doing it with enough competence to confuse everyone who'd expected to find the situation catastrophic. He'd tracked the rumors back. He'd found the Leaky Cauldron by the straightforward method of knowing it existed, and he'd stood outside for 12 minutes working up his nerve. Why did you need nerve? Petunia asked. Because I'm not sure I deserve to be here, he said. Deserve is an odd framework for walking into a pub. He looked at her. I was his godfather's best friend. Sirius is in Azkaban. James and Lily are dead. I survived, and I wasn't able to, he stopped. He looked at Harry, who had migrated from the floor to a bar stool 2 seats down and was drinking a hot chocolate that Tom had produced without being asked, still reading his book with one hand, listening with the other. You're not responsible for what happened to Sirius Black, Petunia said. Something in his expression shifted. You know about that? He asked carefully. I know there was no trial, she said. I know Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper. I know a finger doesn't constitute a body and Azkaban doesn't constitute justice. She held his gaze. I have been gathering information and identifying channels for approximately 3 years. I would appreciate knowing whether you have evidence. Remus Lupin stared at her. You've been, he started. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. By yourself. Not entirely, she said. Rowan Pomfrey has been helpful. And babbling, from Hogwarts. And Tom knows more than he lets on, which is a function of running this establishment for 40 years. She glanced at the bar. Tom continued wiping his glass and did not react. I have been building toward a formal case review. It requires evidence or it requires access to the accused. I have been working on both. I would appreciate knowing if you have either. Remus was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Harry again, who looked back over the edge of his book with those green eyes. I have a memory, Remus said slowly. From the night before everything. I was there. James and Lily had just moved to Godric's Hollow and Peter came by. He was frightened. James thought it was the war doing it, we were all frightened. But Sirius and I, after Peter left, Sirius said to me that something was wrong. He said Peter was too frightened. He said he wanted to check on the Fidelius. He paused. That was the last time I spoke to him. The next day they were dead, and the day after that Sirius was in Azkaban. A memory can be extracted, Petunia said. That's pensive evidence. The ministry would fight it, but it can't be dismissed as testimony alone. You know about pensives. I know about most things now, she said. Not boasting. Just fact. Harry put his book down on the bar. He didn't do it, Harry said. They both looked at him. Sirius, Harry said. He didn't do it. He said this with complete certainty, the way he said things when he'd already thought them through to their conclusion. I've read about the case. Rowan has the magical law review from that year and I read the whole issue. There isn't a record of his wand being examined. There isn't a record of any questioning. There's just, he frowned, that particular frown he made when something didn't fit properly, a lot of people agreeing that it must have been him because it couldn't have been anyone else. Petunia and Remus looked at each other. He's 4, Remus said quietly. He reads quickly, Petunia said. And he has very good recall. She paused. Also, we discuss things at supper. You discuss ministry legal proceedings at supper. We discuss everything at supper. It's when we do the day's learning review. Remus Lupin sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she was coming to recognize, the slight recalibration, the revised estimate, the look of someone who had expected to find a situation they needed to rescue and discovered instead a situation that was, in certain important respects, further along than they were. What can I do? He asked. Come on Tuesdays, she said. Harry has his theory lesson with babbling in the afternoons. You could give him mornings. History, specifically, he needs someone who was present for the recent parts, not just reading about them. He needs to understand what happened and who the players were and why. She paused. And I want your memory formally extracted and notarized. I know a notary in the ministry who owes me a not inconsiderable bookkeeping favor. You have a contact in the ministry. I have several, she said. I have been very helpful to a very wide range of people. Tom made a small sound from behind the bar that might, in another context, have been a laugh. Remus Lupin looked at Harry, who was watching him with open, uncomplicated curiosity. Every Tuesday, Remus said. I'll be here. Good, said Harry, and picked up his book again. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in early December, 3 weeks after Remus's first Tuesday. Not Dumbledore's, Petunia had burned 3 of those since the first, and the third one had provoked her to write back, which she had done in the same measured, precise way she did everything, and which had apparently unsettled the headmaster enough that his 4th letter had been notably more cautious in tone. She'd burned that one too, but with slightly less satisfaction. This letter was something different. It arrived with 2 owls, a ministry post owl and something grey and elegant that she didn't recognize, both landing on the bar at the same time with the coordinated precision of official correspondence. The ministry owl's letter was addressed to Ms. P. Evans, the Leaky Cauldron, Charing Cross Road, London. The second was addressed in handwriting she recognized, after a moment of searching, as that of Augusta Longbottom, who was, she had done her research, a woman of considerable force of personality and a seat on the Wisengamot. She opened the ministry letter first. It was a formal notification that her application for a consultation on Case File 7743-B, which was Sirius Black's non-existent trial record, had been received, reviewed, and declined, on the grounds that the case was closed and no new evidence had been submitted to warrant review. The letter was signed by someone 3 levels below the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which told her that the head of department had seen it and passed it down, and that passing it down was itself a message. She set it on the bar. She opened Augusta Longbottom's letter. Ms. Evans, I sit on the Wisengamot. I have heard your name from several sources I respect. I understand you have an interest in the matter of Sirius Black. I have a similar interest, as it happens, as I have never been comfortable with how that case was handled, and said so at the time in terms that were not well received. I suggest we meet. I will be at the Leaky Cauldron at 10 on Friday morning. I drink black tea. Augusta Longbottom. No preamble. No flattery. No hedging. Petunia liked her immediately. She set both letters side by side on the bar and looked at them. The ministry declined, Tom said. First time always declines, Petunia said. You establish the paper trail. You make the first refusal official. Then you come back with more. She picked up Augusta's letter again. She was Lily's era at Hogwarts, she said, not to Tom specifically, just thinking out loud. She would have been order adjacent. She would know things the official record doesn't contain. She folded the letter carefully. More importantly, she has a Wisengamot seat. That means she can move procedural motions I can't. She's also famously difficult, Tom said. Good, Petunia said. So am I. Friday arrived and so did Augusta Longbottom, at precisely 10 o'clock, in robes of dark green and an expression of permanent mild disapproval that Petunia recognized immediately as the particular face of a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by people doing things less well than she would have done them. She was also, Petunia noticed, trailing slightly behind her a small boy with a round face and the resigned air of someone who had resigned quite young and was philosophically at peace with it. He was perhaps Harry's age, maybe slightly older, and he had a toad in his hands. Harry was at his usual Tuesday morning spot, which was actually a Wednesday spot today because Remus had come yesterday and they'd rearranged things, sitting with a stack of books and a cup of chocolate, and he looked up when Augusta came in, looked at the boy, looked at the toad, and said, "Is that a common or a western?" The boy blinked. "Common. His name is Trevor." "He's going to jump in a moment," Harry said, with the complete calm of someone who has made an accurate observation and is simply reporting it. "His back left foot has been going for about 8 seconds." The boy looked at his toad. Trevor jumped. Augusta watched this exchange with something that moved, very briefly, through surprise and settled in a place that looked like satisfaction. She turned to Petunia. "I like him already," she said, of Harry, in the same tone she might use to evaluate a particularly promising garden specimen. "Everyone does, eventually," Petunia said. "Tea's on the bar." They sat at the window table, the two of them, and the boys sat one table over, Harry helping Neville Longbottom corral Trevor while conducting what Petunia recognized, from the occasional fragment she caught, as a simultaneous low-volume debate about whether toads were better familiars than cats on purely practical grounds. And Petunia and Augusta Longbottom talked for 2 hours. Augusta's involvement in the Black case had been precisely what she'd written, discomfort, voiced loudly, in the wrong room to the wrong people. She had been told that the evidence was overwhelming and the matter was settled. She had asked to see the evidence. She had been shown a file that was, by her account, 3 pages of incident report and a signed statement from Bartemius Crouch Sr. that amounted to "I am confident this is correct." 3 pages, Petunia said. 3 pages, Augusta confirmed. For a charge that carries a life sentence. I was told that the extenuating circumstances of the war made full proceedings impractical, and that Crouch had executive authority. She set down her teacup. He did have that authority. It was granted in the final years of the war specifically for cases of dark arts involvement. It has since been quietly amended, but the cases tried under it were not revisited. Because revisiting them would mean admitting that executive authority was used to circumvent due process, Petunia said. Yes. And the ministry would rather have an innocent man in Azkaban. The ministry, Augusta said, with the particular dryness of someone who has been in the same institution for 30 years and has run out of diplomatic language for its failings, would rather not have an uncomfortable conversation. She looked at Petunia directly. You filed a formal request. Declined within 10 days. You'll file again with supporting documentation. In January, Petunia said. I have Lupin's pensive memory being formally notarized next week. I have 3 witness statements from people who knew Black in the period before the attack and who have said, formally and on record, that his behavior was inconsistent with someone planning betrayal. She paused. I also have a discrepancy in the timing record that I found in the public case file. There's a gap of 37 minutes between the time the explosion was reported and the time of Black's arrest, and no account of his movements in that period. Augusta looked at her. Where did you find the public case file? She asked. Department of Records. 3rd floor of the ministry. It's publicly accessible on written application. The application process is deliberately opaque, but if you read the charter, Petunia paused, the charter was written in 1742 and cross-references the Transparency of Process Act of 1831, and the Actual Access Protocol is a form that hasn't been revised since 1950 and therefore predates most of the classification amendments. She picked up her tea. I had the file within 2 weeks of my first application. Augusta Longbottom was quiet for a long moment. In the background, Neville made a startled noise as Trevor made another break for freedom, and Harry caught the toad with what Petunia recognized, without looking up, as accidental magic, a small directional pull, the kind Harry had been producing since he was an infant, that moved Trevor gently back toward Neville's hands. That's wandless, Augusta said quietly. Yes, Petunia said. He's been doing it since he was 7 weeks old. Augusta watched Harry for a moment. He was now showing Neville a trick with a quill and a sequence of specific folding patterns that produced something structurally improbable, and he was explaining the theory behind it in the patient, engaged way he explained things to other children, different from the way he talked to adults, more generous with analogy, less precise with terminology, but somehow more purely communicative in a way Petunia had noticed and quietly catalogued. He's wonderful, Augusta said softly. He is, Petunia agreed. You've done well by him. Petunia looked at her nephew, who had just made Trevor sit very still by the simple method of showing Neville how to create a small warm circle of proximity that toads, apparently, found deeply comfortable. He had read this in a book and applied it practically within the same morning. He had done this with most things he learned. He's done well by himself, she said. I just made sure the door was open. The second Dumbledore letter of December arrived 4 days later. This one was hand-delivered, not by owl but by a phoenix, which landed on the bar with a self-possession that suggested it was accustomed to making impressions and adjusted its feathers in a way that she might have found impressive under different circumstances. She fed the phoenix a piece of Tom's bread. Tom watched this with one eyebrow slightly elevated, and opened the letter. Dumbledore had, she noted, shifted tone. The previous letters had the quality of a headmaster communicating with a student, authoritative, warm, fundamentally assuming compliance. This one was different. He wrote like a man who had been informed that his correspondence was being burned and had decided that persistence required recalibration. He acknowledged, in terms that were still carefully vague, that she appeared to have established a stable environment. He acknowledged Harry's welfare. He had, she noted with something cold, clearly been checking, though he did not specify by what method. He did not press the blood protection argument this time. Instead, he expressed, and this she read twice, a wish to meet. Not to discuss arrangements, he wrote. Simply to meet the boy. I would come to you, on your terms, at your convenience. I think it would serve everyone well for us to at least have a conversation, rather than conducting this exchange by correspondence. She put the letter down. Tom, who had clearly read it upside down while pretending to polish things, said, He's not wrong that a conversation beats letters. I know, she said. You're not going to say no this time, Tom said. No, she said. I'm going to say yes. On my terms. At my convenience. She looked at the phoenix, which had finished its bread and was now sitting on the bar with an air of having accomplished its mission and being mildly interested in what came next. In the spring. She wrote back on the Leaky Cauldron's notepaper. 2 sentences. Spring. When I'm ready, I'll write to you. P. Evans. She rolled it up, tied it to the phoenix's leg, and the phoenix left. Harry found the owl on the last day of term. Not Hogwarts's term. Harry was 4, he didn't attend Hogwarts, and wouldn't for another 7 years, but Babbling's term, which she'd structured loosely around the school calendar because it meant she could give Harry longer sessions during holidays and shorter but more frequent ones during term time when she was teaching. He'd been in the narrow back garden of the Leaky Cauldron, a small, unexpectedly pleasant strip of outdoor space that Tom kept with more care than the pub's shabby exterior suggested, full of things that were probably magical and definitely happy, when Petunia heard the noise. Not distressed, more exploratory, a series of high, uncertain sounds that suggested something small and alive investigating its own vocal range. She opened the back door. Harry was sitting cross-legged on the garden step with a barn owl chick in both hands. It was very small, smaller than it should have been if it was going to survive on its own, with enormous amber eyes that were currently fixed on Harry with an expression of absolute conviction that this particular human was its person and that matter was settled. Where did it come from? Petunia said. The eaves, Harry said. He was perfectly still. He had a quality, when he was focused on a living thing, of projecting a kind of calm that seemed to work on the creature in question. The owl chick was not struggling. I think it fell. Or maybe it didn't fall, maybe it jumped, but either way it's fine, I caught it, not with my hands, just sort of. He made a vague gesture with one shoulder that she understood to mean the thing I do, and it's been looking at me like this since. And Petunia, she's looking at me, Petunia said. She, Harry confirmed, with the confidence of someone who had made a decision. Petunia looked at the owl. The owl looked at Harry with a devotion that was, she had to admit, quite something. We should find out if she belongs to someone, Petunia said. She doesn't, Harry said. She doesn't have that feeling. The belonging to someone feeling. She's just, new. He looked up. Can I keep her? Petunia had approximately 14 practical objections to keeping an owl in a room above a pub, and she was aware of all of them in the time it took Harry to ask the question. She looked at her nephew's face, which was bright with something that was absolutely not manipulation. Harry had never learned to manipulate because he'd never needed to. He asked for things directly and accepted no with equanimity, which somehow made it twice as difficult to say no to him. What would you call her? Petunia said. Harry looked down at the chick. His expression went serious in the way it did when he was actually thinking, not performing thinking. Lily, he said. Petunia's throat did the thing it sometimes did when she wasn't expecting it. She breathed through it. Yes, she said. All right. Harry's face transformed. He looked back at the owl chick and said, very quietly, Lily, as though introducing himself, and the owl made a sound that was probably just a sound but that Petunia would have sworn, if pressed, sounded like acknowledgement. She went back inside to tell Tom there was going to be an owl. Tom looked up from his bar. She can live in the roof, he said, before she'd said a word. There's a beam up there that's suited for it. You knew. He's been staring at those eaves since Tuesday, Tom said. Petunia shook her head. But the warmth in her chest was the specific, particular warmth of a life that was, despite everything and against a great many odds, becoming what it was supposed to be. The snow came in January and Harry decided he wanted to understand arithmancy. Not because babbling taught it, she taught ancient runes, which Harry was developing a genuine gift for, the kind of gift that made babbling occasionally stop mid-lesson and stare at him with the expression of someone watching a thing unfold that they'd theorized about but never seen. But he'd found a book in the second-hand section at Flourish and Blots, The Thursday Patient Strategy, which Petunia had taught him early and which he'd adopted with enthusiasm, a crack-spine primer on the mathematical underpinnings of spell construction, and he'd brought it home and been quietly absorbing it for 3 weeks before he surfaced from it long enough to ask questions. he asked Petunia. She sat with him at the bar, their usual evening spot, when Tom was doing his closing routine and the fire was low and Lily the owl was a presence in the rafters above them, and they went through it together. She had no formal magical training, but she had excellent mathematical intuition, the kind that had served her first in school and then in the accounts work she'd been doing for 3 years, and she found, as she had been finding, steadily, over the course of these years, that working through magical theory with Harry was less a process of her teaching him and more a process of them figuring things out together, which was both humbling and genuinely enjoyable. He asked, about halfway through the second evening of this, why arithmancy mattered for actual spellcasting and not just theory. Because understanding the structure of something tells you where it's weak, Petunia said. Harry looked at her. That's a very strategy-based way to think about magic. Is that wrong? He thought about it. No, he said. I think it's probably how the best wizards think about it. Not as, he searched for the word, not as art but as architecture. Both, Petunia said. Art tells you what to build. Architecture tells you how it stays up. Harry nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when he was storing something. Lily dropped from the rafters and landed on his shoulder with the confident precision of an owl that has been doing this for 4 months and has never once misjudged the landing. Harry reached up automatically and ran one finger along the top of her head, and she made a sound of satisfaction and settled. Petunia watched her nephew in the firelight, this small person who had been left on a doorstep in November and who had grown, without the usual deficit of loved children in bad circumstances, into someone who was simply and entirely himself, curious, warm, frighteningly competent, completely unafraid of the world that had already decided what it was going to do with him. He didn't know yet, entirely, the full shape of what was coming. He knew about the prophecy, she had told him when he was 3, in terms he could hold, because she'd decided early that he would not grow up in ignorance of his own story. He knew about Voldemort. He knew his parents had died protecting him and that the protection had worked, and that work didn't mean finished. He carried this knowledge the way he carried everything difficult, directly, without drama, as information to be understood rather than weight to be crushed by. She was not going to let anyone take that from him. The Dumbledore meeting was coming in the spring. The case review for Sirius was in motion. Remus came every Tuesday now with stories about his parents and the war, and Harry listened with his whole face and asked questions that made Remus sometimes have to walk away from the table for a moment to collect himself. The world was moving. Harry was growing into it, not waiting for it to come to him. Petunia thought about the door she'd walked through 3 years ago, the heavy oak door of the Leaky Cauldron at midnight, November, with a baby she hadn't planned to love and no plan at all and nothing but the conviction that she was the last thing standing between this child and a world of people who all knew better than her. She still thought she'd been right. She thought about Lily. She thought that Lily would have argued with her about something by now. They'd always argued, the specific friction of 2 people who were too alike in the ways that mattered and too different in the ways that showed. She thought Lily would have argued, and then laughed, and then probably cried, and then said something so precisely, unfairly accurate that Petunia would have spent 3 days being annoyed about it. She missed that. She was not going to perform missing it. But she missed it. Harry looked up. "You're thinking about Mum," he said. She looked at him. "You get a particular face," he said, not unkindly. "What particular face?" He considered. "Like someone looking at a door that's not there anymore." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "Yes. I suppose that's exactly right." He leaned over from his bar stool and put his head briefly against her shoulder, the particular gesture he made when he wanted to offer something without making a production of it, and she put her arm around him and they sat like that for a moment in the quiet of the bar with the fire low and Lily on his shoulder and Tom's careful footsteps moving through the back rooms. A room above the world. It had been exactly that. Their own private altitude, this life they'd built between the pub's old walls and the noise of 2 cities, magical and ordinary, going about their business below. She thought they'd done well with it. She thought they were just getting started. Chapter 3, what his name means. Spring came to Diagon Alley the way it always did, sideways, grudgingly, with one warm week followed by 2 cold ones, as though the weather was negotiating terms. Harry turned 7 in July, and by April he was already operating at a level that made Babbling sit back in her chair mid-lesson and say things like interesting and where did you find that, and occasionally just go silent for a full 30 seconds, which Harry had learned to interpret as a good sign. He had finished the arithmancy primer and moved on to an intermediate text that Petunia had found through a contact at Obscurus Books, a small press that published academic magical theory in editions that sold, typically, to perhaps 40 people and gathered dust. And he read it the way he read everything, fast, non-linearly, jumping between chapters and then returning to the beginning with new context, which was a reading strategy Petunia had watched him develop entirely on his own and which she suspected was connected to the way his mind worked generally, which was less like a river moving in one direction and more like a weather system, everything happening at once across a very wide area. Remus had been coming every Tuesday for 4 months and had evolved from a cautious visitor into a fixture. He taught Harry history the way a good history teacher does, not as a sequence of dates and events but as a series of decisions made by people who had reasons, good and bad and catastrophically mistaken, and Harry engaged with it the way he engaged with everything that interested him, which was completely. He asked questions about motivation. He asked why people chose the wrong side. He asked whether people who chose the wrong side knew they were choosing it. Remus had, on that occasion, been quiet for a long time. Some of them did, he'd said finally. And chose it anyway, because it was easier, or because they were frightened. Some of them genuinely believed it was right. Those are more frightening, in a way. The ones who believed it, Harry said. Yes. Because they weren't pretending. Yes. Harry had thought about this for 3 days. Petunia knew because he'd had the thinking face on at breakfast and at supper and occasionally in the middle of conversations about unrelated things. On the 4th day he'd said, apparently to no one in particular, I think the ones who chose it because they were frightened are actually more frightening. Remus, who'd been there, had looked at him. Because at least if they believed it, you knew where they stood, Harry said. The frightened ones would change sides again if the fear changed. Remus had looked at Petunia. Petunia had looked at her tea. He's 7, Remus had said quietly. He's been 7 for 3 months, she'd replied. He's made quite a lot of progress. The Dumbledore meeting was in April. Petunia had chosen the date carefully, mid-month, a Tuesday, afternoon, after Harry's lesson with Babbling. The timing was deliberate. She wanted Harry present, which meant she wanted him to have had a morning of intellectual engagement first, the kind that put him in the specific mental state she thought of as at his best, focused but not rigid, confident in recent fresh-made understanding, warm from having done something well. She wanted the meeting on ground she knew. She wanted Tom within earshot. She wanted Remus, who she'd asked to stay late, sitting at the far end of the bar with a book and no particular reason to be there other than to be there. Dumbledore arrived at 3 o'clock precisely. He was taller than she'd expected, and she'd been expecting tall. He had the white beard and the half-moon spectacles exactly as Lily had described them in letters that Petunia had reread so many times in the past 3 years she could have recited portions from memory. He was wearing robes of deep midnight blue with small silver stars that moved, and he carried himself with the careful lightness of someone who knows that their presence in a room changes the room and has decided to be thoughtful about it. He looked around the bar when he came in. His gaze moved from Tom, who nodded once, professionally, to Remus at the far end, where there was a small pause, and then to Petunia, standing near the window table with her arms at her sides and her face arranged in the expression she used for meetings where she intended to set the terms. Then he saw Harry. Harry was at the bar, sitting on his stool, with a book open and a half-eaten apple on the counter and Lily perched on the back of the adjacent stool with the self-possessed air of a creature that has never questioned its own right to be anywhere. He looked up when Dumbledore came in the same way he looked up at everyone, with full attention, no performance, just genuine assessment. Dumbledore's expression did something complicated. He had very good control of his face. Petunia had expected that. But there was something in the first unguarded second, not grief exactly, more like the specific expression of someone confronting the distance between the thing they planned and the thing that actually happened, and finding the distance larger than they'd calculated. "Professor Dumbledore," Petunia said. "Please sit down." She poured tea. She didn't do it to be warm, she did it because having something to do with your hands put the other person at a slight disadvantage, gave you a beat of control over the room's rhythm. Dumbledore took the tea with grace, settled into the chair across from her, and looked at her with eyes that were simultaneously kind and exhaustively perceptive. "Miss Evans," he said. "I'm very glad you agreed to meet." "Ms.," she said. "I reverted to Evans 3 years ago." "Of course. I apologize." And he meant it, she noted, a specific kind of man who treats corrections as useful information rather than challenges. "You've built quite a life here." "Yes," she said. "We have." She didn't elaborate. She'd decided in advance not to fill silences. Dumbledore looked at Harry again, who had not pretended to go back to his book but was sitting turned toward them with his elbows on the bar, watching the conversation with open interest. Lily the owl was watching Dumbledore with the focused attention of a creature that has not made up its mind. "You're Dumbledore," Harry said. "I am," Dumbledore said. "You left me on a doorstep." The bar was very quiet. Dumbledore held Harry's gaze. "I did." "It was November," Harry said. "It was cold. I was 1 day old." He said this without heat, without drama, as someone presenting an accurate account. "Petunia found me at 6:30 in the morning." "Yes," Dumbledore said. He did not look away. He did not qualify. "I made a decision I believed was right. I have revisited it, since." "Why did you believe it was right?" Petunia watched Dumbledore carefully. She had expected him to soften the answer, to age it up, to offer a version that was designed for a 7-year-old. He didn't. "I believed the blood protection was strongest in a home where your mother's blood lived," he said. "I believed you needed to be hidden from the world until you were ready for it. I believed your aunt's home was the safest available option." He paused. "I also, I think, made the error of deciding all of this without consulting the people it most affected." "Petunia," Harry said. "Yes. And you?" "I was 1 day old." "You were," Dumbledore agreed. "Which is why the decision should have been made with your aunt, not instead of her." Harry considered this. He had the thinking face on, the slight inward focus, the stillness. "Then, are you going to try to move us somewhere else?" "No," Dumbledore said. And Petunia noted that he'd said it without looking at her first, which meant either that he'd already made this decision before he arrived, or that Harry's directness had made hedging feel impossible. She suspected both. "Good," Harry said, and turned back to his book in a way that was not dismissive but was very clearly, "This particular point is resolved, we may move on." Lily the owl ruffled her feathers once in what appeared to be agreement. Petunia looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at her with an expression that was, unmistakably, something close to rueful. "He's quite extraordinary," he said quietly. "I'm aware," she said. "He's also safe here. Safer, perhaps, than I had anticipated." He wrapped his hands around his teacup. "I want you to know that I won't interfere with what you've built. Not because I've abandoned my interest in Harry's welfare, I haven't, but because I can see that his welfare is genuinely being served." He paused. "I do ask that you keep me informed. Not to maintain control. Purely because there are things moving in the world that I monitor, and his safety requires that someone with that information is in communication with whoever is responsible for him." "You mean the return," Petunia said. "Yes. You believe it's coming." "I believe," Dumbledore said carefully, "that it has not ended. I believe it is slower than it might have been. I believe Harry's survival did something that cannot be fully understood yet." He looked at her steadily. "And I believe that when the time comes, Harry will need to be prepared. Not by the world's expectation of him, but by genuine capability. Then we want the same thing, Petunia said. We simply disagree on the path. Perhaps, Dumbledore said. Though I find your path considerably more interesting than the one I had planned. There was something in that, honesty, she thought. Real honesty, not diplomatic performance. She revised her estimate of him slightly. There's something else, she said. Yes, he said. He had, she noted, expected this. Sirius Black. The bar was quiet again. Remus, at the far end, had put his book down. Dumbledore was still. That case is closed. The Ministry says the case is closed, she said. Those are not the same statement. You know what happened, Professor. You know more than the Ministry file contains and considerably more than you've said publicly. She held his gaze. And I believe you have doubts. He was quiet for a long moment. He was my student, he said finally. And James Potter's student before that. Sirius Black was many things, some of them reckless and some of them arrogant, but I did not believe him to be a betrayer. He paused. I believed the evidence because there was no alternative presented. Because Peter was dead and 12 Muggles were dead and the Ministry was moving very fast through a period of great fear. Peter is not dead, Petunia said. Dumbledore looked at her sharply. I don't have evidence of that yet, she said. But I have absence of evidence for his death, which is not the same thing as evidence of it. I have a timing discrepancy in the incident record. I have a formally notarized pensive memory from Remus Lupin indicating that Sirius was suspicious of Peter in the days before the attack. She paused. I have a case review application already filed and declined. I have Augusta Longbottom moving a procedural query through the Wizengamot. And I have, now, you. Dumbledore was looking at her as though he were seeing her properly for the first time. She allowed him to. What would you want from me, he said. Access, she said. Specifically, access to the Hogwarts Memory Archive. Peter Pettigrew was a student here for 7 years. If he was what I think he was, and I think he was a spy from before the war ended, there will be patterns. There will be things you remember, things other staff remember, things that look different in retrospect. She paused. I don't need your power, Professor. I need your information. Silence. Then Dumbledore said, very quietly, you know, Lily did that too. Built a case piece by piece and waited until she had everything before she put it on the table. Petunia's throat tightened. I'll consider it, he said. And I think, yes. I think I may be able to help. Good, she said, and refilled his tea. The bookshop encounter happened in June. It was a Thursday, which meant Petunia was doing her flourish and blot second-hand section patient strategy, moving slowly through the disorganized back shelves while Harry ranged through the main floor with the focused efficiency of someone who had a list. He always had a list. He made them the night before, cross-referenced with what he already owned, and moved through bookshops the way Petunia moved through markets, with a plan and no sentimentality about deviating from it. She heard the argument from 3 shelves away. That's not right, said a voice. Young, female, precise. I didn't say it was wrong, I said intent precedes execution, Harry's voice, that particular patient button-gauged tone. They're not separable. You can't evaluate intent outside of the execution because the execution is how intent becomes real, right? But then you're evaluating the result, not the intent, and they're not always aligned. If they're not aligned it means the intent was imprecise, or the caster was undertrained, which is a completely separate problem. Petunia came around the shelf. Harry was standing in the middle of the Charms Theory section facing a girl who was approximately his age and height and had blonde hair pulled back with a practicality that suggested she was not particularly interested in its decorative potential. She was holding a copy of Charmcraft, Theory and Application in one hand and pointing at it with the other, in the specific pose of someone who has found their evidence and is about to deploy it. Harry had his own book and was holding it with both hands in the manner of someone who has been holding it for a while and has not put it down because putting it down would concede a point. They were both talking fast. They were both completely engaged. Neither of them looked upset. "He's right about the training point," said a woman nearby, who Petunia recognized, after a moment, as Ophelia Greengrass, a name she knew from the Diagon Alley business community, second daughter of a wizarding family, quiet, well-regarded. She was sitting in one of the bookshop's reading chairs with a book of her own, watching the debate with the expression of someone who has seen this behavior before and long ago decided enjoyment was the correct response to it. "They argue like this often?" Petunia asked. "They've been arguing for," Ophelia checked the clock above the counter, 47 minutes. She paused. "They've never met before today." In the middle of the aisle, Harry and the girl had apparently reached a temporary impasse and were both now looking at the same page in his book. "Okay, but this passage specifically," the girl started. "That's Flitwick's older edition, the revised one changed that section, the revised one changed the emphasis, not the argument, the revised one changed the argument. If you look at chapter 6, I haven't read chapter 6. "I have it," Harry said immediately. "I own the revised. I can lend it." The girl looked at him. "You're Harry Potter," she said. Not with particular reverence, just with the tone of someone completing an identification. "Yes," Harry said. "You're Daphne Greengrass. How do you know my name?" "Your mum," Harry said, with a slight nod toward Ophelia. "She does accounts with the apothecary next to the magical menagerie. Petunia knows her. She mentioned you once." Daphne Greengrass looked at her mother. Ophelia looked blandly at her book. "What did she say?" Daphne asked. "That you'd already read most of your Hogwarts books even though you're not going for 4 years, Harry said. "Which is roughly what I've done, except I'm not going to Hogwarts." Daphne looked at him. "Where are you going?" "I haven't decided yet," Harry said. "Petunia says I should go because the social experience of it is as important as the formal education, but I think I'm already getting pretty good social experience." "You are currently getting it," Daphne said, "by arguing with someone you've never met." "This is great social experience," Harry said, with a seriousness that was also, just slightly, a joke. Daphne looked at him for another moment. Then something in her expression shifted, a recalibration. Petunia recognized it, the same expression she wore herself when she revised an estimate upward. "The chapter 6 argument," Daphne said. "I want to see it." "Come to the Leaky Cauldron," Harry said. "I have the book there. We can finish this properly." He turned to Petunia, who had been watching this entire exchange from the end of the aisle. "Can she come?" he asked. Petunia looked at Ophelia, who was looking back at her with the specific expression of a parent trying not to visibly encourage something while visibly encouraging it. "Ask her mother," Petunia said. "Can she?" Harry asked Ophelia. "Yes," Ophelia said immediately. Daphne Greengrass came to the Leaky Cauldron that Thursday and also the following one and the one after that, until Petunia quietly stopped thinking of it as a special occurrence and started thinking of it as a Thursday arrangement. She and Harry argued about magical theory with a consistency and depth that eventually began attracting the attention of the afternoon regulars, several of whom developed the habit of turning their chairs toward the children's table to listen. Tom produced a second cup of hot chocolate without being asked. Daphne was the daughter of people who occupied a specific complicated space in the wizarding world, old family, significant blood politics, the kind of background that came loaded with assumptions. Petunia had been careful about this, at first. She'd watched, assessed. What she'd found was a child who had been taught a great deal about how the world was arranged and had been quietly, privately skeptical of those arrangements for longer than was probably comfortable in her household. She was careful in ways Harry was not, more precise, less willing to commit to an opinion until she'd examined it from multiple angles, and she had the particular alertness of someone who has grown up around powerful adults and learned early that rooms have dynamics you need to read before you speak. She and Harry were, in this way, interesting together. He operated directly, she operated laterally. He reached conclusions fast, she reached them thoroughly. When they argued, which was often, they reached better answers than either of them reached alone. Petunia noted this and said nothing about it, because some things were better left to develop without commentary. The dreams started in July. Harry turned 7 on the 31st, and the party was small and deliberate: Remus, Rowan, Babbling, the Greengrasses, Tom. Neville Longbottom had come with Augusta, and he and Harry had spent a portion of the evening conducting a careful investigation of the pub's back garden, which Harry had told Neville contained at least 3 plants he couldn't identify and which Neville, who had a genuine talent for herbology that was already visible at age 7, had apparently found deeply exciting. It was a good party. Harry had been happy, genuinely happy, with the uncomplicated brightness of someone who is exactly where they're supposed to be. 2 nights later, Petunia woke at 3 in the morning to Lily the owl making a specific sound from the rafters, not an alarm sound, more like a worried sound, which she had learned to distinguish over 3 years of cohabitation, and she went into Harry's room. He was asleep. He was not peaceful. He was still, which was the deceptive part. He didn't thrash or cry out, he just lay completely motionless with his brow furrowed and his hands gripping the sheet and his face arranged in an expression of intense, focused concentration that looked, in the half-light, disturbingly like the face he made when he was working through something difficult. Lily dropped from the curtain rail and landed on the pillow beside his head and pressed close against his hair, and something in his expression eased. Petunia sat on the edge of the bed. In the morning, Harry said he didn't remember the dream. He said this the way he said things that were true but not complete, and she let it sit. She asked Remus on Tuesday if Harry had said anything. Remus said no, but that Harry had asked him on the previous Tuesday whether the connection, he'd used that word specifically, between a caster and a curse could survive if the curse broke. Remus had not had an answer. Petunia went to Babbling. Babbling was quiet for a longer time than usual when Petunia described the dream behavior and Remus's account of Harry's question. The scar, Babbling said. Yes. I've had a theory, Babbling said slowly, that I've been reluctant to raise because the implications are significant, and I wasn't sure the evidence warranted. She paused. The night he survived, the curse rebounded. We all know this. What we don't know, what I don't think has been adequately explored, is what a rebounded killing curse does to the surface it bounced off. She looked at Petunia directly. Curses leave marks. Complex curses, particularly those tied to living magic, sacrifice, love, intent, leave complex marks. Not just physical ones. You think the dreams are connected to him, Petunia said. She didn't say the name either. She and Babbling had an unspoken agreement about it. To whatever remains of him. I think, Babbling said carefully, that Harry may be able to feel things through the scar. Not clearly. Not fully. But something. Petunia sat with this. Should I tell him? He already suspects, Babbling said. Or he's worked most of it out. The question he asked Remus wasn't curiosity about general theory. He was checking his own hypothesis. Petunia went home and sat at the bar and drank tea until Tom came in to set up for the afternoon and found her still there. You have a thinking face, he said. It's complicated. Want to talk about it? No, she said. Then, yes. Actually, yes. She told him. Tom listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, with the complete attention of someone who has heard many difficult things over 40 years behind a bar and knows that the first thing most people need is just to be heard without the listener making the problem about themselves. When she finished, he said, Tell him. He'll be better with information than without. He's 7. He's Harry, Tom said simply. She told him that evening. She sat across from him at the window table, their usual evening spot, fire low, the pub quiet, and she said, I need to talk to you about the dreams. He looked at her. I know you remember them, she said. You don't have to tell me what's in them. But I need to tell you what I think they might mean, and I need you to hear it. All right, he said. So she told him. Not softened, not vague, the actual theory, the actual implications, as babbling had explained them and as she had since refined them in her own understanding. She told him that the scar might be a connection. She told him that the connection ran both ways. She told him that whatever remained of Voldemort in the world, and they both believed something remained, might be capable of being felt through it. Harry was quiet through all of this. When she finished, he said, I already thought that. I know. I wasn't sure whether to tell you. You can always tell me, she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, in the dreams, it's not really seeing. It's more like a feeling. Cold and thin. Like something very far away that's trying to get closer. He frowned. It doesn't feel strong. It feels like something that's been broken and is very slowly putting itself together. Does it feel dangerous? He thought about this with his full, genuine consideration. Not yet, he said. But I think it will. Then we make sure you're ready before it is, she said. He looked at her. You're not scared of it. I'm terrified of it, she said plainly. But being terrified of something doesn't help you prepare for it. Information does. Planning does. Being genuinely capable does. She held his gaze. Which is why we're going to keep doing everything we're doing, and we're going to do it better, and when the time comes, we won't be caught out, Harry said. No, she said. We will not. Harry nodded. He reached across the table and picked up his cup of tea. She'd started letting him have actual tea at 6, half-strength, which Remus had thought was funny until he remembered that Remus himself had been drinking tea since he was 5 and had no business being amused, and drank it with the settled air of someone who has received useful information and filed it correctly. Can I tell Daphne? He asked. Petunia considered. The connection part, yes. The full detail, when you're older. She'll figure out the full detail anyway, he said. Probably, Petunia agreed. But let her do it at her own pace. Dumbledore came back in August, unannounced. This was, she felt, a deliberate choice on his part. He'd come announced in April and she'd had the tables set before he arrived, so to speak, and she suspected he wanted to see what they looked like when they weren't prepared. She didn't mind. They looked exactly the same. He came in on a Saturday morning when Tom was restocking the cellar and Harry and Daphne were at the window table doing what had become a regular joint study session, books open between them, conducting the low-intensity running argument that was essentially their baseline conversational mode. Lily the owl was on Harry's shoulder. Neville, who had started appearing on Saturdays because he and Harry had developed a friendship that operated largely through the mutual investigation of things, was in the back garden looking at the unidentified plants. Dumbledore stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. Petunia came down the stairs with a ledger under her arm and found him there. Professor, she said. I'm sorry to come unannounced, he said. No you're not, she said, without heat. But it's fine. Sit down. He sat at the bar. She put the kettle on. Harry had glanced up when Dumbledore came in, registered him, exchanged a brief look with Daphne. Daphne's expression was the measured one she wore around adults whose significance she knew, and gone back to his book, though Petunia noted that the argument had paused. I've been thinking about the black situation, Dumbledore said quietly, once she had tea in front of him. She turned to face him. I went back through my own memories, he said. And I found something. He reached into his robes and placed a small vial on the bar, a memory. Petunia recognized the container, slim and silvery. A memory from the week before Godric's Hollow. Peter Pettigrew, at a staff meeting I hosted for Order members. He was nervous, Sirius had said. I dismissed it at the time as the general strain of the war. In retrospect, looking at the memory closely, he paused. He was nervous in a particular way. Guilty nervous, not frightened nervous. I should have seen it. Petunia looked at the vial. You're giving this to me, she said. I'm adding it to your case, he said. Which is, better assembled than anything the ministry has, I suspect. I'll have it notarized by the end of next week, she said. She picked it up carefully. There's one more thing, he said. He looked toward the window table. Harry's education. His formal education, I mean. Not what you're giving him here, which is, he paused, and she heard something genuine in the pause, remarkable. But Hogwarts. I want to discuss, he'll go, she said. Dumbledore looked at her. He'll go when he's 11, she said. On his terms, knowing what he is and what the school is and what people will expect of him. Not as a symbol. Not as a destiny. As a student who happens to also be dealing with a prophecy, which is a problem he'll approach the way he approaches every problem, which is head-on and better informed than anyone expects him to be. A pause. He won't hide, Dumbledore said. Not a question, an observation. No, she said. People will, try to shape him, she said. Yes. They'll try. I'd like to see it work. From the window table, Harry said, without looking up, I can hear you. I know, Petunia said. I'm looking forward to Hogwarts, Harry said. He turned a page. I have a list of things I want to do there. What sort of things? Dumbledore asked. Harry looked up. There was a quality to his gaze, direct, unperformed, the look of someone who has been told exactly who they are and believes it without arrogance, that made Dumbledore, Petunia noticed, go very still. Learn, Harry said simply. And find out what I can actually do. Properly, with proper equipment and proper instruction. He paused. And I want to fix the defense against the dark arts position, because Remus told me the curse on it and the turnover and I think it's being wasted. Dumbledore blinked. I'm 7, Harry said, correctly reading the expression. I'll have a more specific plan by 11. Daphne, beside him, did not look up from her book but said, with complete neutrality, he'll have a more specific plan by 8, realistically. Harry considered. Probably, he agreed. Dumbledore looked at Petunia. You've done something genuinely extraordinary, he said quietly. I opened a door, she said. He did the rest. Dumbledore picked up his tea. He looked like a man revising an understanding of something he thought he understood, and finding the revision less uncomfortable than he'd expected. Outside, Neville came in from the back garden with soil on his knees and a cutting from one of the unidentified plants wrapped carefully in his handkerchief, with the expression of someone who has had an excellent morning. Harry, he announced, the middle one is a venomous tentacula variant. I'm almost certain. Look at the leaf margins. Harry stood up immediately and went to look. Daphne followed, because she was not going to be left out of anything interesting. Tom came up from the cellar, took in the scene, the children crowded around Neville's plant cutting, Dumbledore at the bar, Petunia making a fresh pot of tea, and said nothing, just reached for a glass. You come here often, Dumbledore said to Tom, apparently feeling the need to say something. I live here, Tom said. And have for 40 years. Ah, said Dumbledore. She'll have him ready, Tom said, not looking up from his glass. Whatever's coming. She'll have him ready. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Outside, Harry was debating the tentacula identification with Neville with the same energy he'd given to the Flitwick argument, and Daphne was pulling a book from her bag with the expression of someone who always has the relevant text. Yes, Dumbledore said. I rather think she will. Petunia poured the tea and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the world had attempted to put her nephew in a cupboard under some stairs and had gotten, instead, this. A boy who read legal records at 4 and debated charm theory with future Hogwarts students for sport and knew exactly what was coming for him and intended to meet it standing up. She thought Lily would have laughed. She thought she would have told Lily about it in a letter, a long letter, the kind she'd never written. She thought that some doors, when you finally walked through them, turned out not to lead where you'd been told they led at all. They led here. To this specific room, on this specific morning, where the tea was getting cold and the children were arguing about a plant and everything was, despite everything, entirely as it should be. Chapter 4, The Boy Who Remembered Remus Lupin Had a Specific Walk. Harry had noticed it the first Tuesday Remus had come to the Leaky Cauldron, that particular gait of someone accustomed to moving through spaces without claiming them, the slightly lowered shoulder, the habit of standing near walls rather than in the center of rooms. He moved like a man who had spent a long time being careful not to take up too much space and had become so good at it that the habit had colonized his posture entirely. Harry thought about this sometimes. About what it did to a person, spending years being apologetic about existing. He was 9, and he had been thinking about it for 2 years. The thinking had started the summer he turned 7, around the same time as the dreams, around the same time he'd started paying a different kind of attention to the adults in his life. Not the fond, general attention of a child cataloging the people around him, but a more specific kind, the kind that noticed patterns and asked questions about what produced them. Remus moved like someone apologizing. Dumbledore moved like someone carrying. Tom moved like someone watching. Petunia moved like someone who had decided something and was in the process of making it true. He filed these things and thought about them, and they changed how he understood conversations, which changed how he had conversations, which led to a Tuesday morning in October when he was sitting outside Flourish and Blot's waiting for Petunia to finish inside, and a man in patched robes sat on the curb 3 feet away from him, opened a book, and didn't say anything. Harry looked at him. He was perhaps in his early 40s, though the lines around his eyes made that hard to gauge. Brown hair going gray at the temples, a recentish cut that was already growing out in a way that suggested he did his own haircuts and was optimistic about the results. A scar along his jaw that was old enough to have faded to silver. He was reading with the focused intensity of someone who needed the reading the way other people needed air. He hadn't noticed Harry. Or, Harry revised this, he had noticed Harry and was choosing not to make anything of it, which was a different thing. "You know who I am," Harry said. The man looked up. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, recognition, something more complicated, and then a kind of careful stillness. "Yes," he said. "You knew my parents," Harry said. A pause. "I knew your father. From school." "Not my mum." "I knew your mother too." "Less well." Harry looked at him properly. Brown eyes that were doing something careful. A quality of self-containment that was slightly different from Remus's, less apologetic, more habitual, like someone who had learned to contain themselves for reasons that had nothing to do with shame. "You're not comfortable," Harry said. "I'm sitting on a pavement outside a bookshop," the man said. "You're not comfortable with being recognized," Harry corrected. "Not in general. But specifically today. In relation to my parents." The man was quiet. "My name's Harry," Harry said. "I know," the man said. Then, slowly, "I'm Elias Meadows. I was in the Order of the Phoenix. During the war." Harry filed this. He knew about the order, Remus had told him, and Dumbledore had mentioned it, and there was a list he'd compiled from various sources of people who had been members. Meadows was a surname on that list. Dorcas Meadows, killed by Voldemort directly. Elias was not a name he had. "Brother or cousin?" Harry asked. Something shifted in the man's face. "Brother." "I'm sorry," Harry said, and meant it without performance. Elias Meadows looked at him for a moment. "How old are you?" 9. "You're very direct." "Petunia says there's no point in being indirect about things that matter," Harry said. "You can be tactful without being vague. Most people confuse the two." Elias looked at him for another beat, then made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your aunt raised you?" "Yes." "She was Lily's sister?" "Yes." Harry paused. "Remus talks about my dad a lot. He doesn't talk about my mum as much." I think it's because it's harder. She wasn't his friend the same way, but she was important to him for different reasons, and those are the ones that are hard to say. He looked at Elias. Did you know her well? Elias was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, a wizard in lime robes arguing with his shopping, two teenagers with Hogwarts scarves arguing about something else, a cat sitting on a windowsill above them with the profound indifference of cats everywhere. She was the person who made me believe the war was worth fighting, Elias said finally. Not because she was powerful, though she was. Because she talked about people like they mattered individually. Not the side, not the cause. Each person. He paused. I'd never met anyone who could make you feel like you, specifically, were worth the trouble. Harry thought about this. She made Petunia feel like the wrong one, he said. For not being magical. I don't think she meant to. But Petunia spent a long time thinking Lily's world was more important than hers because Lily made it sound so good. Elias looked at him. They loved each other, Harry said. But love doesn't make you careful, always. Sometimes it makes you careless in specific ways. A silence. You've thought about this a lot, Elias said. I've had to, Harry said simply. I need to understand them. Not as a story, as people. Because if I understand them as people I understand myself better, and understanding myself is fairly important, given, he paused, everything. The door to Flourish and Blots opened and Petunia came out with a bag over her shoulder and a precise assessment of Harry sitting on the pavement next to a stranger. Harry, she said. Elias Meadows, Harry said. Order of the Phoenix. His sister was Dorcas. He knew Mum. Petunia looked at Elias Meadows, who stood up from the pavement with the specific air of someone who has just had a conversation they hadn't planned and isn't sure whether to be unsettled or grateful. Miss Evans, he said. Mr. Meadows, she said. She read him the way she read everyone, that quick thorough accounting. Then, are you doing anything on Tuesday mornings? Elias Meadows became their first new Tuesday in a year. He knew things about Lily's time in the order that Remus didn't, different angles, different contexts, the specific texture of who she'd been in the field rather than in friendship. He talked about her with precision and care, the way you talk about someone who mattered to you in ways you've spent years trying to articulate. Harry listened to all of it and built, slowly, a portrait that was more complete than anything he'd had before. Not Lily the legend. Not Lily the sacrifice. Lily the actual person, stubborn, sometimes startlingly blunt, possessed of a specific charm that worked on people who generally couldn't be charmed, deeply funny in ways that caught people off guard, occasionally wrong and willing to be told so, genuinely warm in a way that was not performance but a kind of active choice she made every day. Harry kept a notebook. Not of facts, he had excellent recall and didn't need to write things down to retain them. He kept it for the things he wanted to think about more. The notebook was currently 3/4 full and he'd had it for 2 years. Daphne, who had inherited access to Tuesdays through her own Thursday arrangement and the resulting general permeation of her presence into the Leaky Cauldron's ecosystem, read the notebook once with Harry's permission and then was quiet for a full 10 minutes. You're building a complete picture, she said. I'm trying to, Harry said. For yourself, or for later? He thought about this. Both. I need to know them to know myself. And I need to know them to know what I'm doing this for. He paused. I'm not just fighting some war because a prophecy says I have to. I'm doing it because they're my parents and it cost them everything and I want the thing they paid for to actually matter. Daphne looked at him for a moment. That's much better reasoning than the prophecy, she said. Yes, Harry agreed. The prophecy is someone else's framework. This is mine. The letter arrived in November. Petunia read it at the bar on a grey Thursday morning with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and when Harry came downstairs she slid it across to him without comment. It was from the Ministry. From the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, 3rd tier down. It informed Ms. P. Evans that her second application for a review of Case File 7743, B had been received, considered, and referred to the Committee on Historical Case Review, where it would be assessed at the committee's discretion. There was no timeline. There was no indication of what assessed at the committee's discretion meant in practical terms. The letter was signed by an undersecretary whose name Petunia had learned to associate with correspondence that wanted to look like action without being any. Harry read it twice. "Referred to committee," he said. "Yes. That's not declined." "No," she said. "Which means they've looked at what we submitted and decided they can't dismiss it outright. Which means they're worried. But the committee will sit on it." "Committees," Petunia said, "are where things go to stall. Unless someone on the committee wants it to move." "Augusta," Harry said. "She's not on that committee. But she has connections to 3 of the 7 members. She's already working on it." Petunia picked up her tea. "This is what progress looks like in institutional systems, Harry. It looks like nothing happening, until suddenly it does." Harry sat on his barstool and looked at the letter. "He's been in there for 8 years, he said. "Yes. 8 years and nobody," he stopped. "Nobody looked," Petunia said. "Or the people who looked weren't in positions to push. Or they had their own reasons for not pushing." She looked at her nephew. "That's why we're doing this. Because we are in a position, we're building more of one every month, and we're not going to let it sit." Harry nodded. He looked at the letter for another moment, then folded it carefully and put it in the file. He'd started keeping a physical file for the black case, organized with an almost architectural precision, where every document had a category and every category had a timeline. The file was currently an inch thick and growing. He went to get his books for the morning. He found Remus outside Flourish and Blot's 6 weeks later, and it was not by accident. He'd been planning it for 3 weeks, since he'd read, in the Magical Law Review, which he'd been getting through a standing order that Petunia had set up with the publisher, which had originally been for her own research and had gradually been colonized by Harry's, a paper on coercive confessions and the use of veritaserum in emergency wartime proceedings. The paper referenced the black case in a footnote, and the footnote referenced an original witness who had refused to testify. He tracked the footnote back to a journal entry, the journal entry to a complaint filed with the Department of Records, and the complaint back to its filer. Remus John Lupin. He'd never mentioned this. For years of Tuesdays, and he'd never mentioned that he'd filed an official complaint. Harry didn't say any of this on the pavement outside Flourish and Blot's. He waited until they were walking. Remus was heading to Gringotts. Harry said he'd walk with him, and he let the silence sit for half a block, which was long enough for Remus to relax into the company, and then he said, "You filed a complaint in November 1981. Remus missed half a step. "I found it in the Department of Records," Harry said. 3 weeks ago." They walked for a moment. "I filed it," Remus said carefully. "And it was rejected," Harry said. "Filed under insufficient standing to challenge ministry proceedings, which is an interesting classification because you absolutely had standing as a known associate of both parties." He paused. "Who rejected it?" Remus exhaled. "Crouch. Bartemius Crouch Sr., Harry said. "Who also authorized the arrest in the first place." "Yes. That's a conflict of interest." "Yes. Did you note that in your complaint?" A pause. "I was 21, Remus said. "I was," he stopped. "I was not in a good place, that winter. I'd lost James and Lily, and I believed I'd lost Sirius too, and I made the complaint because someone told me I should make a formal record, but I didn't push it. I didn't have he stopped again. "The capacity," Harry said. "Not a criticism. A completion." "Yes," Remus said quietly. They reached the front of Gringotts. Harry stopped on the steps. "I want to add your complaint to the file," he said. "Not as a failed attempt. As evidence of a conflict of interest in the original rejection of review, which makes the current referral to committee stronger." Remus looked down at him. He had a specific face he made when Harry did this, when Harry said something that moved the situation forward in a way Remus hadn't seen. It wasn't quite surprise anymore, after 4 years. It was more like a specific kind of feeling that Harry didn't have a good word for yet, something like moved but more particular than that. "You need my permission to access the complaint file," Remus said. "Yes," Harry said. Remus sat down on the Gringotts steps. He sat down the way people sat down when their legs made the decision before their brain did. Harry sat next to him and waited. "I haven't," Remus started. He pressed his hands together. "I have spent 8 years believing that the complaint was a failure. That I'd failed serious. That if I'd been better, stronger, more." "You were 21, Harry said again. "You were right to file. The system was wrong to reject it. Those are two separate things." Remus looked at him. "You can't keep punishing yourself for the system's failure," Harry said. "Petunia told me that once about something else, and it's one of the most useful things I know." He paused. "The complaint is evidence that someone tried to do the right thing immediately, was blocked deliberately by the same person who caused the problem, and that the block itself was improper. That's useful. That's actually," he thought for a moment, "that's probably the piece that makes the conflict of interest argument watertight." Remus was quiet for a long time. A goblin came out of the bank doors, looked at 2 humans sitting on the steps, assessed this as not its problem, and walked past. "All right," Remus said finally. "Yes. Use it." "Thank you," Harry said. They sat on the steps for another moment. "You look like him," Remus said. "When you're thinking. You get the same," he gestured vaguely. "James used to do that thing with his eyes when he was working something out, this very specific focus." "Petunia says I get it from Lily," Harry said. Remus laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "You get it from both of them. That's the terrifying part." "Is it terrifying?" "In the best possible way," Remus said. Harry thought about this. About what it meant to have 2 people he'd never met living in him in observable ways, in the way he thought, the way he read a room, the way he moved toward a problem. He thought about Elias Meadows's description of Lily. He thought about the James Potter of Remus's stories, reckless and funny and deeply loyal and occasionally too confident by half. He thought he was made of both of them, and that made him neither of them, and that was fine. That was its own thing. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," Remus said. "Do you think he's still serious? After 8 years in there?" A silence. Remus looked at the street in front of them, the ordinary busy movement of Diagon Alley going about its morning. "Azkaban takes things from people," Remus said carefully. "The Dementors, they feed on happiness. On memory. After 8 years," he paused. "I think there are parts of him that won't be what they were. But I think Sirius Black had a kind of fundamental stubbornness that not even Azkaban can fully dismantle." He looked at Harry. "I think he held on because he knew he was innocent. That's what people who know say, that the thing that keeps you from losing yourself in there is a thought that the Dementors can't reach. Something so clear and certain that they can't feed on it." "His innocence," Harry said. "His anger," Remus said. "Which is sometimes better." Harry thought about Sirius Black, the version assembled from Remus's stories, Elias Meadows's mentions, the photographs in the Order records that Dumbledore had quietly made available. A man who laughed loudly and rode motorbikes and was the first Black in generations to be sorted into Gryffindor and had apparently walked away from his entire family at 16 without looking back. A man who had been Harry's godfather for 15 months before the world took him. A man who was, somewhere right now, in a place designed to destroy people from the inside out, holding on to his anger like a rope. "I'm going to get him out," Harry said. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't performance. It was just a true statement about the future, said in the same tone he might say the weather will change. Remus looked at him. "I know," Remus said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain, as though he'd known it for years and was simply confirming, made Harry understand that he'd meant it completely. The power had been doing new things. It had always done things, the directional pull he'd had since infancy, the capacity to move objects and change light and generate warmth without a wand. Babbling called it ambient magic, which was her precise way of saying something unusual is happening here that conventional frameworks don't fully explain. She'd been careful to document it. She'd been more careful to teach him how to understand it rather than just how to use it, which Harry appreciated, because understanding was always more useful than technique alone. But since the summer, since he'd turned 9, it had changed. Not in kind. Still the same essential quality, a kind of projection of intent, an extension of himself into the space around him. But bigger. More specific. More responsive to what he was actually thinking rather than just what he was feeling. He discovered this in July, during a Thursday session when he and Daphne had been running a theory exercise about countercharms, specifically, the theoretical problem of blocking a spell whose caster you couldn't see. Babbling had set it as an intellectual puzzle, not a practical one, since neither of them had wands. Harry had been working through the conceptual structure, talking it through with Daphne, and he'd reached a point in the argument where he needed to demonstrate a principle about directional blocking. He'd done it. Without a wand. Without a formal spell. He'd simply constructed the thing he was describing, out of the ambient magic around him, and held it in the air for approximately 4 seconds before it dissipated. The silence that followed was different from the usual silence after Harry did something unexpected with his magic. This was the silence of Babbling sitting very still and looking at the space where the construct had been. "How did you do that?" she said. "I thought about the structure," Harry said. "The same way I'd think about the arithmetic structure on paper. Except I did it in the air." "You manifested the arithmetic structure." "I think so," Harry said. Babbling had sat back. Daphne was looking at the empty air with the expression she wore when she was updating her understanding of something. "That's not supposed to be possible without a wand," Babbling said. "Not with that level of specificity." "Is it bad?" Harry asked. "It's not bad," Babbling said. I need to think about it." She looked at him. "Have you done this before?" "I've been doing versions of it," he said. "Small ones. Since about June." She thought for a moment. "Don't tell the ministry." Harry nodded. He hadn't planned to. Since then he'd been quietly exploring it, the way he explored everything, systematically, with documentation in the notebook. What he could build. How long it lasted. What made it collapse. How much concentration it required and whether that requirement decreased with repetition. The answer to that last question was yes. Rapidly. By October he could hold a simple construct for 20 minutes with minimal active concentration. By November he could do it while reading. Daphne had started helping him test variants. She had a gift for identifying logical gaps in a structure, which translated surprisingly well into identifying weaknesses in a magical construct, and their Thursday sessions had evolved from theory debate into something that was, Petunia had noted with carefully contained alarm, beginning to look like practical training. "She's not a witch yet," Petunia had said. "She's a natural theorist," Harry said. "She doesn't need to cast anything. She just needs to tell me when the structure's wrong. She's 9. She's extremely good at it," Harry said, which was true and they both knew it. Petunia had watched them work for 20 minutes and then gone to write Babbling a long letter. The Malfoy encounter happened on a Friday afternoon in December, and Harry handled it in a way that Petunia, who was there, described to Tom that evening as extremely hairy. The Malfoys were in Flourish and Blots. Lucius Malfoy was a name that Harry knew from multiple sources, the sort of name that appeared in wartime records as someone adjacent to the worst events without quite being documented inside them, who had subsequently bought his way back to respectability with a combination of money and the specific institutional memory loss that tended to follow wars. His son Draco was approximately Harry's age and was currently standing in the main aisle of the bookshop with the bearing of someone who had been told from birth that the world was arranged for his convenience. Harry was looking at a shelf. Draco came and stood nearby, looked at Harry, looked at what Harry was looking at, and said, "That's too advanced for most people." Harry looked at him. "I know. I've already read the first 3 chapters. A beat." Draco had clearly prepared for either deferral or ignorance and had no ready script for this. "You're Potter," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "My father says," Draco started. "I know what your father says," Harry said, pleasantly. "He says a lot of things. Most of them are politically motivated. That's his right." He took the book off the shelf. "This chapter 7 is the most interesting, theoretically. The bit about construct integrity in high-pressure situations. Have you read it?" Draco stared at him. "No. You should," Harry said. "If you're going to Hogwarts in 2 years you'll want the theoretical foundation. The practical stuff is much easier once you have it." He put the book back and looked at Draco directly. "I'm Harry. I know you know that, but introduction seems right." A pause. "Draco," Draco said, slightly off balance. "I know," Harry said. "Listen, the issue you'll have at Hogwarts is that everyone's going to have opinions about both our names before you and I have actually done anything yet. That's going to be annoying for both of us. So I'm going to suggest that whatever your father has told you about me, you wait until you've formed your own view." Draco's expression was doing several things. "And if I already have a view," he said, recovering something of his prepared manner. "Then I'd be curious what it's based on," Harry said, and there was nothing hostile in it, just genuine interest, which was somehow more unsettling to Draco than hostility would have been. "Because I've read everything publicly available about the war and about the people in it, and my view of most people is considerably more complicated than most of the available narratives suggest. Including the people on the right side." He paused. "Including mine." From halfway down the aisle, Lucius Malfoy had become aware that his son was talking to Harry Potter and had approached with the smooth, deliberate pace of a very large chess piece. "Mr. Potter," he said. Harry turned and looked at him. Not up, Lucius was much taller, but at him, with the specific quality of attention that registered the full person without granting them any particular status they hadn't yet established. "Mr. Malfoy," Harry said. There was a brief moment where Lucius had, clearly, expected some version of childish deference and received instead a 9-year-old looking at him with the calm assessment of someone considerably older. Lucius paused, recalibrating, considerably less sheltered than one might have expected. "My aunt is very thorough," Harry said. From the end of the aisle, Petunia had arrived with the efficiency of someone who always knew where Harry was. "Lucius," she said. "Petunia Evans," Lucius said. A pause. "I hadn't realized you were acquainted." "We're not, particularly," Petunia said. "But I know your name and I know your accountant and I know 3 of the 5 people who handle your Gringotts accounts have been using the same inefficient filing system since 1987, which I've been asked about twice." She said this with perfect pleasantness. "Harry, are you finished?" "Yes," Harry said. He looked back at Draco. "Think about what I said. About forming your own view." Draco said nothing. But he was, Harry noted, not performing disdain. He was actually thinking about it. In the street afterwards, Petunia said, "That was extremely you." "Is that good?" "It's entirely good," she said. "Though I suspect you've confused Draco Malfoy considerably." "Good," Harry said. "Confused people have to think. Thinking's useful." Remus came to Christmas. It was the first time, for years of Tuesdays, and he'd always been somewhere else for Christmas, which Petunia understood was partly about his other condition and its specific demands, and partly about the particular loneliness of people who believe themselves poor candidates for real celebration. She'd invited him directly and bluntly, which was the only way to invite people who were accustomed to declining invitations. He came. Tom did Christmas with the specific competence of someone who had hosted it 40 times and had opinions about every element. Rowan came, and babbling, and the Greengrasses, Ophelia and Daphne's younger sister Astoria, who was 6 and had a personality that consisted of approximately equal parts sweetness and ferocity. Neville came with Augusta, and Augusta brought a bottle of something she described only as very old and very appropriate and opened herself. Harry sat between Remus and Daphne at the long bar table that Tom had extended with what Petunia privately suspected was magic he'd never admitted to, and was doing the thing he did at gatherings, which was being genuinely present with each person he was talking to in turn, not performing sociability but actually interested, actually listening, drawing out the conversation with the warmth of someone for whom other people were consistently, genuinely interesting. She watched him. She watched Remus watch him, and the particular quality of Remus's expression when Harry turned to say something, this specific helpless fondness that had been building in Remus across 4 years of Tuesdays and had by now become one of his dominant characteristics in Harry's presence. She watched Tom move around the table with more warmth than his usual manner suggested, refilling things without being asked, saying very little but being completely present. She watched Astoria fall asleep in Augusta's lap at 9 o'clock and Augusta arrange her carefully and then continue her conversation without interrupting it, and she watched Daphne watch this with the expression of someone who had complicated feelings about her family that she was still working through. After dinner, Harry came and stood next to Petunia where she was washing up. She'd refused Tom's offer to do it magically, she found the physical process useful for thinking, and leaned against the counter. "Good Christmas," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Remus cried a bit during dinner." "I know. Is that all right?" "Crying at Christmas is a sign of a life with enough feeling in it," she said. "Yes. It's all right." Harry was quiet for a moment. He picked up a cloth and started drying things without being asked, which was a habit he'd developed at 6 and maintained with the consistency of someone who had decided it was simply what one did. "I'm going to be at Hogwarts in 2 years," he said. "Yes. And when I come back for holidays, you'll come here," she said. "This is home." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He dried a cup. "I think I'm ready. Or, I'll be ready by then." "You're already ready," she said. "You'll be readier." He smiled, that specific Harry smile, not the performance smile, the real one, the one that changed his whole face and was, she thought, almost entirely Lily's. She thought of November, 4 years ago. The cold kitchen. The purple ink. The baby on the counter with Lily's eyes, watching her with terrifying patience, waiting for her to make the right decision. She'd made it. She'd been making it every day since. Outside the Leaky Cauldron, London went about its winter business, entirely unaware that inside a small pub on Charing Cross Road, the boy who had survived the unsurvivable was drying the Christmas dishes and asking thoughtful questions about institutional injustice and had a plan for almost everything that was coming, assembled from 4 years of conversations and books and arguments and love, and was completely, entirely, dangerously ready. Somewhere in Azkaban, Sirius Black held on. Harry intended to go get him. 2 years was enough time to finish the case. He had already started counting. Chapter 5, The Trial That Wasn't the Ministry of Magic smelled like ambition and old paper. Harry noticed this the first time he walked into it, which was a Tuesday in March, 2 months before his 11th birthday, and he noticed it the way he noticed most things, quickly, completely, filed into the growing architecture of his understanding of how the wizarding world actually operated versus how it described itself. The ambition was in the way people moved, fast, purposeful, carrying themselves with the specific self-importance of people who believed they were doing important things in important corridors. The old paper was in the air itself, centuries of records and memos and decisions made in rooms with no windows. He walked in beside Petunia, who was wearing her good coat and carrying a leather briefcase that contained, among other things, 14 months of accumulated documentation, 2 formally notarized pensive memories, a certified conflict of interest complaint, and a letter from Albus Dumbledore that she'd spent 3 weeks convincing him to write in terms that were unambiguous enough to actually be useful. Behind them came Remus, who was wearing his best robes and moving with a slightly different version of his usual careful gait, still careful, but forward-pointing, the difference between someone trying not to take up space and someone who had decided that this specific occasion required exactly as much space as necessary. Behind Remus came Augusta Longbottom, who moved the way she always moved, like someone who had decided decades ago what she thought of most institutions and had subsequently been proved correct. The atrium was full of people doing ministry things. A wizard in mustard-yellow robes was arguing with the security desk about something involving a suspicious cauldron. Two witches were conducting a conversation at speed while also consulting different floating memos. The golden fountain in the center was gleaming in the overhead light. Harry looked at the fountain as they passed it. The statue, wizard and witch and various magical creatures arranged in a hierarchy that got less subtle the longer you looked at it, looked back at him. He looked away and kept walking. The hearing before the Committee on Historical Case Review had been scheduled for 10 o'clock. They were early, because Petunia was always early to things that mattered and had raised Harry to consider tardiness a form of disrespect. They sat in the anteroom outside Committee Chamber 4, which was on the third floor, and the anteroom smelled exactly like the rest of the ministry except more specifically of the particular anxiety that gathered in rooms where people waited for official decisions. Harry went over the case structure in his head. Not because he needed to, he had the file memorized, but because the act of reviewing it was grounding, and he knew this morning was going to require whatever grounding he could find. The case had two main tracks. The first was procedural, demonstrating that the original proceedings were irregular, that the rejection of Remus's complaint in 1981 represented a conflict of interest, and that the committee was therefore obligated to review the case under the principles of Fair Process Act 1869, which Augusta had identified as the most useful legislative lever because it predated most of the classification amendments and couldn't be quietly overridden. The second track was substantive, the pensive memories, the timing discrepancy, the witness testimony, and the theoretical argument about Pettigrew. This was the harder track because it required the committee to accept not just that the process had been wrong but that the conclusion had been wrong, and institutions resisted wrong conclusions more fiercely than they resisted wrong processes because wrong conclusions required someone specific to have been wrong. The person who had been wrong was Bartemius Crouch Sr. Crouch was not currently on the committee. He had, in fact, been removed from the ministry after the Bertha Jorkins scandal 3 years ago and was living in semi-reclusion. This was useful. It meant that the committee members were not personally defending Crouch so much as defending an institutional decision made by a previous person, which was a slightly weaker attachment. Slightly. They're going to push back on the Pettigrew theory, Remus said quietly, beside him. I know, Harry said. The Pettigrew theory is the soft part. We don't need it to hold the case up, we just need it to create enough doubt in the substantive track. The procedural track is what does the actual work. Remus looked at him. When did you start thinking in terms of tracks? Petunia uses the metaphor for institutional navigation, Harry said. Two parallel arguments. One to create the obligation to act, one to demonstrate what acting correctly looks like. She's terrifyingly good at this. She is, Harry agreed. She says it's because she spent 12 years managing Vernon Desley's social life and business contacts, which required exactly this kind of multi-layered navigation but with worse stakes and no meaningful outcome. She says this is much more satisfying. Remus laughed quietly. Petunia, who had been reviewing something in the briefcase, looked up. Harry. When they address you, direct, factual, no performance, Harry said. And if they try to make the case about you rather than about Sirius, redirect immediately. Personal relevance is legitimate to establish standing, it's not a substitute for evidence. Good. She went back to the briefcase. Augusta, who had been watching this exchange, said to no one in particular, I've been doing this for 30 years and I still review my arguments the morning of. So do I, Harry said. But mine are memorized so I do it in my head. Augusta looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. I know. That's what I meant. She returned to her notes. The door to Chamber 4 opened. There were 7 committee members. Harry had researched all of them. Cornelius Fudge was not on this committee. He was currently the Minister for Magic and had other things to be worried about, but his influence was visible in the composition of the room, which contained 3 members who had voted consistently in favor of Fudge's preferred outcomes and 2 who hadn't and 2 who could go either way. The chair was a witch named Griselda Marchbanks, who was old enough to have been examining students since before Dumbledore's time and carried herself with the specific authority of someone who had never particularly cared what anyone thought of her. Harry had noted, in his research, that Marchbanks had abstained on 2 of the 3 votes where Fudge's preferred candidate had won. He had interpreted this as principled disengagement rather than allegiance, which was a different category. "Ms. Evans," Marchbanks said. "Mr. Lupin. Ms. Longbottom." She looked at Harry. "And Mr. Potter." "Good morning," Harry said. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who had been told something about a person and was revising it in real time. Then, "The committee has reviewed the submitted materials. We will now hear from the applicant." She looked at Petunia. "Ms. Evans. You filed the original application." "I did," Petunia said. She stood up. She had the briefcase open. "The application rests on 2 grounds, which I'll take in sequence." She was extraordinary. Harry watched his aunt present the case with the focused admiration he'd been developing since he was old enough to understand what she was doing. She didn't perform confidence, she simply had it, the kind that came from knowing the material better than anyone in the room, and she moved through the procedural argument with a precision that left no gap for casual dismissal. The conflict of interest in Crouch's rejection of Remus's complaint. The principles of Fair Process Act. The obligation to review. 2 of the Fudge-aligned members tried to push back on the Act's applicability. Petunia answered both without hesitation, citing the specific 1869 text and 2 subsequent cases in which it had been applied, one of which was a ministry case and one of which was a Wisengamot ruling that Augusta had identified 3 months ago and which they'd spent 6 weeks preparing to reference. The pushback subsided. "Procedural grounds established," Marchbanks said. "Now the substantive argument." "I'll yield that to Mr. Lupin," Petunia said, "who has direct relevant experience." Remus stood up. Harry watched him. There was something different about him today, not the carefully maintained composure of someone managing anxiety, but something underneath that, a quality of purpose that Remus didn't usually wear visibly. He looked like someone who had been waiting 10 years to be in this room and had decided that now he was here he was not going to waste it. He presented his pensive memory methodically. The night before Godric's Hollow. Pettigrew's behavior. Sirius's specific language. He was calm and clear, and when one of the committee members asked whether the memory could have been altered, he said, flatly, that it had been verified by the notary under the standard authentication protocol, which was on page 4 of the submitted documentation. The member checked page 4. Then came the timing discrepancy. This was the piece Harry had found, at 9 years old, in the public case file. He'd flagged it, and Petunia had had it independently verified by a wizard historian she knew who specialized in wartime records, and the verification was in the file, and when Petunia placed it before the committee it sat there as what it was, 37 unaccounted minutes between the reported explosion and the documented arrest, in a case that had been closed without anyone asking what happened in those 37 minutes. A committee member named Tiberius Ogden, who was one of the 2 who could go either way, leaned forward. How was this not identified at the time? Because there was no formal hearing at which evidence could be examined, Petunia said. There was no process in which the record could be checked. An executive decision was made under emergency authority without the standard evidentiary review, and the case was closed before anyone with the standing to question it had access to the file. And you got access to the file through a public access application under the 1742 Department of Records Charter, Petunia said. Cross-referenced with the Transparency of Process Act 1831. The application form is available to anyone who reads the full charter rather than the summary document. Ogden looked at her for a moment. The summary document is the one in public circulation. Yes, she said. He sat back. Then Augusta spoke. Augusta speaking in an official proceeding was a specific experience. Harry had never seen it before and found it deeply educational. She had a way of delivering information that presupposed you were intelligent enough to understand it, which had the effect of making people very keen to demonstrate that they were, and she combined this with a direct authority that was not aggressive. It was simply the manner of someone who had been in these rooms for 30 years and had no patience for pretending she hadn't. She moved through the Wiesengemot precedents for case review. She cited 3 historical instances in which executive wartime decisions had been posthumously overturned. She noted that in all 3 instances the individuals in question had been dead, and that the current case was unusual and that the individual was alive and could therefore be examined directly. Veritaserum, she said. Standard ministry issue. The committee has the authority to order it. Azkaban has administered it twice in the past 10 years for internal investigations. She looked around the table. The argument for refusing a Veritaserum examination of Mr. Black has never been made, because the opportunity has never been formally requested. It is being formally requested now. The room was quiet. Harry watched the committee members. The 3 fudge-aligned ones were looking at each other with the particular expression of people calculating whether resistance was worth its cost. The 2 neutral members were reading the documents. Marchbanks was watching the room with the steady attention of a chair who had already made up her mind and was waiting for the process to arrive at the conclusion she could then ratify. The door opened. Everyone turned. The man who walked in was not expected, and the way the room reacted told Harry everything he needed to know about who the man was before the man said anything. He was perhaps 60, spare-framed, with a face that looked like it had once been handsome in a severe way and had maintained the severity while losing the rest. He moved with the contained energy of someone accustomed to rooms responding to his presence, and the 3 fudge-aligned committee members sat up in the specific way that confirmed he was either their superior or someone they were afraid of. Cornelius, Augusta said, with a pleasantness that contained an edge like a filed nail. Minister Fudge closed the door behind him. I happened to be on the floor, he said, with the ease of someone who had absolutely not just happened to be on the floor. I thought I'd observe. He looked at the committee. Do carry on. He sat in the seat along the wall, not at the table, not officially part of the proceeding, but present in a way that changed the weight of every chair at the table. Committee members who report to a minister, Harry observed, do not behave the same way when the minister is watching. Marchbanks looked at Fudge. Then she looked at Harry. Harry had not spoken yet. He'd intended to speak at the end, if needed. Petunia had suggested this, the strategic weight of a final statement versus an opening one, but the dynamic of the room had just changed and he adjusted. He stood up. Mr. Potter, Marchbanks began. I'd like to speak, Harry said. Not asking. Notifying. A beat. Then Marchbanks said, the applicant's family representative may speak. Harry looked at the committee. He looked at Fudge. My name is Harry Potter, he said. I'm 11 years old in 2 months. My parents were killed when I was 15 months old and the person accused of betraying them to the man who killed them was imprisoned without trial under emergency authority by a single official who subsequently rejected the only formal challenge to that decision. That official is no longer in the ministry. He paused. I've read the case file. I've read everything publicly available about the events of November 1981. I've spent 2 years helping to assemble the documents you have in front of you. And I want to tell you what I believe, because I think it matters that you hear it from me specifically. The room was very quiet. Fudge was looking at him with an expression that was moving between several things. I believe Sirius Black is innocent, Harry said. Not because he was my godfather, though he was. Not because I want him to be innocent, though I do. Because the evidence supports it and the process that convicted him was wrong and the ministry has the tools to find out the truth right now and has simply not been asked to use them. He looked at Fudge. I think everyone in this room knows the right answer to this question. I think the only issue is whether being right is worth the cost of admitting that someone was wrong 10 years ago. He paused. And I think that cost is much lower than the cost of leaving an innocent man in Azkaban for another 10 years, particularly if what everyone says is true about the situation out there, that things are not as finished as we'd all like them to be. Because if things are not finished, and they're not, then Sirius Black is going to be needed. And I would like him to be in a state to be useful when that happens. Silence. Marchbanks was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Ogden was looking at the documents. Fudge was looking at Harry with the face of a man who had come into a room expecting to manage a situation and discovered the situation was managing itself in a direction he hadn't anticipated. The committee will deliberate, Marchbanks said. The anteroom again. Harry sat beside Petunia and looked at the wall opposite, which had a portrait of a former ministry official who was asleep and therefore blessedly uninterested in commenting on things. Fudge coming in changes things, Remus said. It might, Petunia said. But Marchbanks doesn't care about Fudge. The 3 members who do care might vote differently now that he's watching. They might vote differently either way, Augusta said. They know that being on the wrong side of this has costs too. The documentation we've submitted is on the record now regardless of what they decide. If they vote to continue blocking a case this well evidenced, that vote is on the record. She settled her robes. People who prioritize self-preservation are actually more reliable than people with principles, in committee situations. Self-preservation cuts both ways. Harry looked at her. Petunia says something similar. Your aunt is a sensible woman, Augusta said. What happens if they vote no? Remus asked. We appeal to the Wisengamot, Petunia said. Which is slower and harder and requires a full hearing. We've already started preliminary groundwork for it. You've already started, this was never the only avenue, she said. We came here because it's the fastest route, not the only one. She looked at Harry. Are you all right? He thought about this honestly. Yes. I keep thinking about what it's like in there. For him. He's held on this long, Remus said quietly. I know, Harry said. That's what I keep thinking about. The kind of person who holds on that long. He looked at the floor. I want to meet him. Nobody said anything. There wasn't anything to say to that improved it. After 45 minutes, the door to Chamber 4 opened. The vote was 5-2. Formal Veritaserum examination of prisoner 7743, Sirius Orion Black, to be conducted within 30 days under standard ministry protocol. Results to be assessed by a 3-person independent panel appointed by the committee chair. Findings to be reported to the committee within 60 days. Marchbanks delivered this with the flat efficiency of someone reading a grocery list, which Harry appreciated because it meant the decision was as uncomplicated as it sounded. 5-2. Petunia said, "Thank you, Ms. Marchbanks," and picked up her briefcase and walked out of Chamber 4 into the corridor, and Harry followed her, and then Remus, and then Augusta, and the door closed behind them. Remus stopped walking. He stood in the ministry corridor with people moving around him and he pressed both hands over his face and his shoulders went up and then up again and Harry looked at Petunia and Petunia gave him a small nod, so he stepped forward and put his arm around Remus's back without saying anything. After a moment Remus lowered his hands and looked at the ceiling for a few seconds. Then he looked down at Harry. 5-2, Remus said. 5-2, Harry confirmed. That's, Remus stopped. Harry. I know, Harry said. They stood in the corridor. Augusta was already heading for the lifts with the purposeful stride of someone with the next thing already in motion. Petunia was beside Harry with one hand on his shoulder, not squeezing, just present. Around them the ministry went on doing ministry things, entirely unaware that in Corridor 7 on the 3rd floor, a decade of wrong was in the process of beginning to be corrected. The 30 days were the longest Harry could remember. Not passive waiting, they spent the month preparing for what came after, because Petunia had drilled into him early that the point of winning a proceeding was what you did with the outcome. They prepared for the 3 scenarios: confirmed innocent, ambiguous result, and the small dark third option that nobody said out loud but that Harry had spent one night thinking about before he put it in a drawer and left it there. Dumbledore came in the second week. He sat at the bar with tea and said, quietly, that he had been wrong to accept Sirius's guilt as readily as he had. He said this plainly, without qualification, in the manner of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through genuine reckoning and not through the need to be seen reckoning. Harry appreciated the difference. "You'll look after him," Harry said. "When he comes out. Professionally, I mean. He'll need to be reinstated. The Black estate will need to be unfrozen. There'll be a compensation claim and the ministry will stall it." "I can help with several of those," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "That's why I'm telling you now." "So it's planned." Dumbledore looked at him. "You've planned the aftermath." "I've planned 3 versions of the aftermath," Harry said. "Depending on outcome." A pause. "What about Pettigrew?" Dumbledore said. Harry had been thinking about Pettigrew since he was 7. "He's alive. I believe he's been hiding as a rat somewhere. Finding him is the second problem. The first problem is serious." He met Dumbledore's gaze. "One thing at a time." "You sound like your mother," Dumbledore said. And the way he said it, soft, private, without performing the emotion, made Harry's throat tighten in the way it did when Lily came into a conversation unexpectedly and was suddenly very present. "Good," Harry said. On the 14th day, the Veritaserum examination was conducted. They were not present. Harry had known they wouldn't be, it was an internal ministry procedure, but knowing it and experiencing the day were different things, and he spent most of it at the Leaky Cauldron with Daphne, who had come without being asked because she had an excellent sense of when she was needed. They were in the middle of a book when Harry said, without preamble, "What if he's not intact? What if 10 years in there has, then we deal with that too," Daphne said. "You say that very easily." "I say it easily because it's true," she said. "The outcome of the examination doesn't change what we've done or why. And it doesn't change who he is. It just tells us what the next part looks like." She turned a page. "You're good at the next part. You've been good at it every time." He looked at her. "Stop catastrophizing," she said. "Read your chapter." He read his chapter. The results came on a Wednesday morning. Not by letter, by owl, a ministry owl that arrived at 7 in the morning and sat on the bar with the air of something carrying cargo. Harry was already up. He'd been up since 5. He untied the official envelope from the owl's leg and the owl, its function complete, departed without ceremony. He set the envelope on the bar and looked at it. Petunia came downstairs. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Harry. She sat on the bar stool beside him. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. He opened it. The language was formal and ministry standard and took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in 1 sentence. Harry read it twice anyway, the way he read everything twice. Petunia read it at the same time. "The panel has determined, on the basis of administered Veritaserum and subsequent questioning, that the prisoner's account of events on the night of November 1, 1981 is consistent with innocence of the charges for which he was imprisoned. The prisoner's account implicates one Peter Pettigrew as the individual responsible for the betrayal of the Potter family and the deaths of the 12 Muggle bystanders. The panel recommends immediate formal review by the full committee with a view to release." Harry set the letter down. Petunia picked it up and read it a second time. Tom came in from the back, looked at the two of them, looked at the letter. "Well," he said. "He's innocent," Harry said. And the words, simple and direct as they were, did something to the room. Something settled. Something that had been a weight, present so long it had become background, shifted. Tom set down the cloth he was holding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Right," and disappeared into the back kitchen, and came back 10 minutes later with a full English breakfast for Harry that had not been ordered, and set it on the bar, and that was Tom. The full committee hearing was 2 weeks later. The recommendation for release passed 6-1. The single dissenting vote was a ministry staffer named Umbridge who was, Augusta said, absolutely predictable and also going to be a problem eventually, a statement she made with the patient certainty of someone who had been watching certain people for years and knew exactly where they were going. The paperwork took 4 days. Petunia spent those 4 days navigating the paperwork with the specific focused energy of someone running a race they can see the end of. She called in every favor she'd built over 4 years of Diagon Alley accounting. She sent 3 letters that were, she described to Harry, not polite but legally precise, which was her specific genre of threat. She sat at the ministry for 6 hours on the 3rd day and did not leave until a specific form had been located, signed, countersigned, and correctly filed. On the morning of the 5th day, Harry stood outside Azkaban. He had not expected to be there. He had thought, they had all thought, that Sirius would be transferred to the ministry first, processed, released into Dumbledore's or Remus's custody. But the release procedure had, at some level he hadn't quite tracked, been simplified, and it was happening at the facility, and Petunia had looked at Harry that morning and said, "Do you want to come?" and he'd said yes before she'd finished asking. Azkaban was worse than he'd imagined and he'd imagined it with some precision. He stood on the dock with Petunia on one side and Remus on the other and a ministry official he didn't know who had come to process the release, and the air was cold and wet and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Even from outside he felt it, not through the scar, not this time, just as a person standing near a place designed to remove things from people. He stood up straight. After 20 minutes the main door opened. 2 Azkaban guards came out first, then the ministry official went forward to do his part with the paperwork, and then Sirius Black walked out. He was thin. Significantly thinner than the photographs Harry had studied, though he'd known to expect this. His hair was long, his robes were the ones he'd arrived in 10 years ago, which didn't fit anymore. He walked with a slightly stiff movement that suggested someone relearning how their body worked in open air. He looked up and saw Remus first. Something happened in his face that Harry couldn't catalog, too many things at once, in someone who had been in a place specifically designed to stop your face from doing complex things. "Moony," he said. His voice was rough and quiet. "Padfoot," Remus said, in a voice that Harry had never heard from him before. They moved toward each other in the manner of people for whom the distance between them was intolerable, and Remus's arms went around Sirius and Sirius held on with a grip that suggested held on was exactly the right description of what he'd been doing for the past decade. Harry stood and watched and let it be what it was. After a moment Sirius looked up over Remus's shoulder and his gaze found Harry. Harry had thought about this moment a great many times. What he'd say. What Sirius would look like. What a decade in the worst place in the world did to a face. What he hadn't thought about was that the eyes would be the same. Pale gray, clear, and despite everything, not vacant. Not hollowed. There was a lot missing, he could see that, whole sections of a person that had been worn away. But there was something at the center that was still entirely and stubbornly present, exactly the way Remus had described, the anger, the certainty, the irreducible fact of knowing who you were. Sirius looked at him and something in his expression went very still. James's eyes would have been hazel, Petunia said, from beside Harry. He has lilies. Sirius looked at her. It was the first time he'd registered her, and Harry watched him process her presence, Lily's sister, whom he'd presumably heard described, standing on the Azkaban dock in her good coat looking back at him with the expression she used on everyone until she'd formed her own view. "You're Petunia," Sirius said. "Yes," she said. "You raised him," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone trying to measure a distance. "Thank you," he said. "Not grandly. Just directly." "Don't thank me," she said, in the same tone. "Just don't waste it." Sirius looked at her for another second. Then something in his face moved, not quite a smile, the muscles weren't quite remembering how yet, but the intention of one. He looked back at Harry. Harry stepped forward. There were any number of things he might have said at this moment. He'd thought about several of them over the course of 2 years of case preparation and the last 5 days of acute anticipation. He'd thought about the important things, the case, the outcome, what came next, what Sirius needed to know about the current state of the world. What came out was, "I read everything about you." Sirius blinked. "Everything available," Harry said. "Remus told me a lot. Dumbledore gave me access to some order records. The Magical Law Review had 3 pieces that mentioned you and I read all of them twice." He paused. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time." Sirius looked at him. "I've been told," Sirius said, slowly, by the person currently giving me a pensive level look at his own face, "that you got him out." "We got you out," Harry said. "There was quite a lot of us." "I'm going to need details," Sirius said. "I have a file," Harry said. "It's quite thorough." Something in Sirius's face did the smile and tension thing again, stronger this time. "You made a file," he said. "I make files for most things," Harry said. "That's very—" Sirius stopped. He looked at Harry with the specific helpless quality of someone experiencing several emotions in a body that's been preventing emotions for a decade and is now completely unequal to the traffic. "That's very Lily," he said. "And very James. At the same time. Which should be annoying but is actually—" He stopped again. "Are you all right?" Harry asked. "No," Sirius said, with the complete honesty of someone who has been in a place specifically designed to make honesty irrelevant and has therefore decided to start over with it entirely. "But I will be." "I know," Harry said. He meant it. They didn't go back to Grimmauld Place. The Black family home was, everyone agreed, the wrong starting point for someone relearning how to exist. They went to the Leaky Cauldron. Tom had the corner table clear. He had tea on the bar. He had food that he'd been making since Petunia had sent ahead by owl that morning, which was the kind of practical gesture of care that Tom made instead of saying things, and which was understood by everyone present as equivalent to a long speech. Sirius walked into the Leaky Cauldron and stopped and looked at the room, the low ceiling, the fire, the candles, the warm noise of the afternoon crowd, and his face did something that was, Harry thought, recognition. Not of this specific place, but of the category of it. A place that worked. A place that was alive. "Right," Sirius said quietly. "Sit down," Tom said. "You look terrible." Sirius sat down. He looked at Tom. "You always say that," Sirius said. Tom paused. "You've been here before." "September 1st, 7 years running," Sirius said. "You never remembered me either." "I'm not offended." Tom considered this. "What did you drink?" "Fire whiskey," Sirius said. "Tea," Tom said, and poured it. Sirius looked at the tea. He looked at Harry, who had taken the seat across from him. Remus was beside Sirius. Petunia was at the bar, not at the table, but close enough, keeping a specific watching brief in the way she watched over all things that mattered to her, present without inserting, available without hovering. "Tell me about him," Sirius said to Harry. "Tell me about James. What you know." Harry looked at him. "Remus says he was reckless," Harry said. "And funny. And loyal to the point of it occasionally being a flaw. He was good at transfiguration and he knew it, which Remus says was sometimes annoying. He loved my mom before she loved him and he was patient about it in a way that surprised people who knew him otherwise." He paused. "Elias Meadows, did you know him?" "Dorcas's brother," Sirius said. "He said my dad was the kind of person who made you want to be braver than you were," Harry said. "He said it was specific to Dad, not general inspiration, actually personal. He made you braver about whatever your particular version of brave was." Sirius was quiet. "And Mum," Harry continued. "She was the most important person Elias knew during the war. She talked about individuals. Not causes. Each person. He talked for a long time. He told Sirius everything he'd assembled, all the pieces, the notebooks full of other people's memories of his parents, the portrait he'd built over 4 years of careful listening and questioning and recording. He talked about them the way he'd learned to think about them, not as symbols, not as sacrifices, as people. With all their specific qualities and habits and flaws and the particular ways they'd existed in the lives of the people around them. Sirius listened without interrupting. Once, about halfway through, he stopped looking at Harry and looked at the table instead, for about 30 seconds, and Harry paused, and then Sirius looked up and said, "Keep going," so Harry kept going. When he finished, the table was quiet. "How long have you been building that?" Sirius asked. "Since I was 7, Harry said. Remus started it, really. But I kept going because I needed to know them. Not for the prophecy, just for me. I needed them to be real people I understood, not stories." Sirius looked at him for a long time. "They would have loved you," he said. "Not because you're clever, though you clearly are, offensively so. Not because you're powerful, though I suspect you are that too." He paused. "Because you went looking for them. Because that mattered to you enough to do all of that." He glanced at Petunia. "Both of you." Petunia, from the bar, did not respond. But something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Harry knew her well enough to know what it meant. "Right," Harry said. "So. Practical matters." He reached into his bag and produced a folder, which was thin but organized. "I have a summary of the current legal situation regarding the Black Estate. Remus has been in contact with a property management firm about Grimmauld Place, and Dumbledore has offered, and I'd encourage you to take it, not because Dumbledore is always right but because in this specific matter he has the institutional access to make things faster, to facilitate the formal reinstatement with the ministry." Sirius stared at him. "You made a folder," he said. "I told you," Harry said. "You made a folder," Sirius said, to Remus, as though seeking confirmation of what he was seeing. "He makes folders," Remus said. "There's a whole filing system." Sirius looked back at Harry. The smile and tension on his face had by now developed into an actual, complete smile, imperfect at the edges from disuse but unmistakably genuine, and it was, Harry thought, exactly the smile from the photographs. "James would be furious," Sirius said. "He hated paperwork." "I know," Harry said. "Remus told me. That's why I do it. Someone has to." The afternoon moved around them. Tom brought more tea and then food and then more food. Remus and Sirius talked in a low, private way of two people relearning a language they'd both been afraid they'd forgotten. Harry sat with his folder and his tea and watched his godfather come slowly, slightly, incrementally back into the world. Outside, London did what London does. Petunia stood at the bar with Tom and they watched the table and Tom said nothing and Petunia said nothing and it was one of the better conversations they'd had. Harry had one more thing to do before the year was out. His Hogwarts letter was coming in 2 months. He was ready. Chapter 6, Heir to Everything. She built. The letter arrived on Harry's birthday. Not dramatically, no 30 owls, no cascade of envelopes through the fireplace. Just Lily, landing on the bar at 7:30 in the morning with a single envelope tied to her leg and the air of a creature that had been asked to deliver something important and had done so with appropriate gravity. She waited until Harry untied it, then flew straight back to the rafters and tucked her head under her wing, apparently considering her part complete. Harry turned the envelope over in his hands. Green ink. His name and address written in a hand that was formal without being stiff, Mr. H. Potter, The Leaky Cauldron, Charing Cross Road, London. The Hogwarts crest on the back. Petunia was at the bar with her morning tea and a ledger, watching him from the corner of her eye in the way she'd always watched him when something was happening, not intrusively, just present. Tom came up from the cellar with a crate of something and set it down, looked at the envelope, and went back to the cellar without saying anything. Harry opened it. He read it once. Then he put it down on the bar and picked up his tea and drank some of it and put it back down. "Well?" Petunia said. "It's exactly what I expected," Harry said. "Book list, supply list, start date, platform information." He paused. "They've misspelled Ptolemy in the recommended reading." Petunia put her pen down. "Are you going?" He looked at the letter. Then at the bar, the wood worn smooth by 40 years of Tom's cloth. The fire that went green at its edges. The rafters where Lily slept. The stool he'd sat on for 10 years learning things and arguing about things and becoming whoever he was. "Yes," he said. "Obviously." She picked her pen back up. "Good," she said. Sirius came for his birthday breakfast. He was looking better than he had in March, not fully himself yet. There were still rough patches, still the occasional morning where Remus had reported finding him sitting at a window for long periods without apparent purpose, working through something that resisted language. But the physical weight was coming back, and more importantly the quality of his presence had shifted. He was still careful in ways that would probably be permanent, but the carefulness was becoming his own rather than the habit of a prison, and Harry found he could already see the man Remus described in the stories, the particular irreverence, the specific warmth, the way he moved through a room like he'd decided to enjoy it. He arrived with Remus and a gift that was, when Harry opened it, a small mirror. "Two-way," Sirius said. "I've got the other one. James and I used them at school." He paused. "If you ever need me." Harry looked at the mirror. He looked at Sirius. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the full-length version of those 2 words. They had breakfast. Tom's birthday breakfasts were a specific institution, generous to the point of slight absurdity, and then the Greengrasses arrived, and Neville and Augusta, and Rowan, and Babbling, and Elias Meadows who had become a fixture by the simple method of being worth keeping. The party was, as always, small and exactly right. Daphne gave him a book. She had given him a book for his birthday every year since they were 9, always something he hadn't found yet, which required considerable effort given how thoroughly he covered available ground. This year it was a slim volume called Construct Magic and its Classical Applications, which had apparently been out of print since 1923 and which she'd found through a bookseller contact she'd developed independently. He looked at it. He looked at her. "How did you find this?" he said. "I have my methods," she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done a difficult thing well. "Your methods are better than mine," he said. "In this specific area," she agreed. "In most others you're intolerable." He grinned. "Thank you. Really." She picked up her tea. "Go to Hogwarts and don't embarrass us." Define embarrass. Don't set anything structurally important on fire in the first week. What about the second week? Use your judgment, she said. The 2 months between his birthday and September 1st moved with the fast slow quality of time before a significant change, simultaneously rushing and dragging, each day full and the total somehow also compressed. Harry spent them the way he spent everything important, preparing thoroughly and then letting the preparation go, trusting that what he'd built was in him and didn't need to be carried consciously. He had one significant conversation in August. Sirius had been at the Leaky Cauldron on a Wednesday evening. He came several times a week now, a habit that had grown naturally from those first difficult months and that Harry suspected served a function for both of them that neither had needed to discuss. They were playing chess on the bar. Sirius played chess the way he did everything, aggressively and with a willingness to sacrifice pieces that occasionally looked like recklessness and occasionally turned out to be something else entirely, when Sirius said, without looking up from the board, "People are going to make a lot of assumptions about you at Hogwarts." "I know," Harry said. "People who've heard the name their whole lives and think they know what it means." "I know," Harry said. He took Sirius's knight. "I'm not worried about it." Sirius looked up from the board. "Not worried, or prepared for it." Harry thought about this distinction carefully because Sirius had made it carefully. "Both. I've thought about what people will expect. Famous orphan, prophecy child, symbol of the war. I've thought about it a lot. He paused. But I've also noticed that the people who try to put me in a category tend to find the category doesn't fit, and then they have to deal with the actual person. I think that's fine. I think that's actually how it should work. Sirius looked at him. And the ones who push harder, he said. The ones who have a specific idea of what you should be and want you to be that. Then I'll be disappointing, Harry said. I've had 10 years of people having ideas about what I should be. Dumbledore thought I should be hidden. The Ministry thought I should be managed. Half of Diagon Alley thought Petunia was doing it wrong. He moved a pawn. None of them changed anything. I don't see why Hogwarts would be different. Sirius was quiet for a moment. James, he said, would have said almost exactly that. In exactly that tone. Remus says his tone was more arrogant, Harry said. It was, Sirius agreed. Yours is more, considered. Which is actually more frightening. He moved his queen. Check. Harry looked at the board for 3 seconds and moved his bishop. Checkmate, he said. Sirius looked at the board. Then he started laughing, real laughter, the full version, which was still slightly surprising every time Harry heard it because it was so completely itself. Merlin's beard, Sirius said. I've been setting that up since move 8, Harry said. I know, Sirius said. That's the frightening part. September 1st was grey and smelled of rain and London going about its morning business. Petunia had been up since 5. Harry had woken at 6 to find her already at the bar with tea and the ledger she wasn't really working on. He'd sat beside her and they'd drunk tea together in the particular quiet they'd developed over 10 years of sharing a space and knowing each other well enough that silence was a form of conversation. At some point Tom came in and made breakfast. At some point Lily flew down from the rafters and spent 20 minutes on Harry's shoulder before migrating to the luggage pile with the air of a creature supervising the packing. The trunk was ready, it had been ready since the previous Thursday, because Harry packed methodically and in advance. Sirius arrived at 9. Remus was already there. The 4 of them walked to King's Cross together, Harry with his trunk on a trolley and Lily in her carrier on top, Petunia with her good coat and her briefcase that she'd brought out of habit and then left in the bar and then gone back for, Sirius and Remus walking behind them and talking quietly in the way they'd rebuilt over 6 months of weekly Tuesdays and gradual relearning. King's Cross was its usual morning chaos. Harry had been here before, he'd done the journey twice with Petunia just to know the geography, and he moved through it with the familiar confidence of someone who knows their environment. Platform 9 3/4 was exactly where it should be, the barrier as unremarkable to walk through as a door, the platform on the other side filling with steam and noise and families and owls and the particular 1st of September energy of 100 children at different levels of excited and nervous. Harry walked onto the platform and stood still for a moment. He'd read about this. He'd had it described by Remus and babbling in Dumbledore. But the actual sensory reality of it, the steam, the scarlet engine, the noise, was its own thing, and he let himself have it. Petunia came through behind him and stood beside him. He looked at her. She was looking at the train with the expression she wore when she was feeling something she'd decided to experience privately. The specific expression he'd learned at 4 years old and understood better with every year, the one that was about Lily, about this platform, about September 1st that had happened before he existed. She came through here, Harry said. Every year, Petunia said. 7 years. She paused. I hated it. I know, Harry said. I don't hate it now. He looked at her. I know, he said again, differently. She put her arm around his shoulders briefly, the way she did when something mattered more than her usual self-containment could quite manage, and he leaned into it for a moment. Go, she said. You'll miss the train. I have 20 minutes, he said. Go anyway, she said. Explore it. You've been thinking about this train for months. He had, rather. He looked at Sirius, who was watching him with the expression he'd been developing since March, the one that was fond in a way that went deep, the way you're fond of something that contains people you loved. Right, Sirius said. Every week, Harry said. I have a schedule. Of course you do, Sirius said. Remus stepped forward and put his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder and said nothing, which was the Remus version of a speech. Harry picked up Lily's carrier. He walked to the train. He found a compartment and put Lily on the seat beside him and watched the platform through the window while more people boarded. The first person to knock on his compartment door was a boy with red hair and something on his nose, who stuck his head in and asked if the compartment was free. Yes, Harry said. The boy came in and sat across from him. He had the relaxed, unpretentious manner of someone who hadn't thought about first impressions because it hadn't occurred to him that they required thought. Ron Weasley. Harry Potter, Harry said. Ron blinked. He looked at Harry's forehead, reflex, Harry noted, and didn't particularly mind it, people needed a moment, and then back at his face. Right. Yeah. Everyone knows the name. I know, Harry said. Do you want a chocolate frog? I brought a lot. Ron's expression clarified immediately into one of uncomplicated warmth. Yeah, actually. They'd been talking for 10 minutes, Ron was easy to talk to, Harry found, in the way of people who were fundamentally honest without making a performance of it, when the compartment door opened again and a girl looked in with the specific energy of someone conducting a sweep. Have you seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost one. Harry stood up immediately. Neville Longbottom. Brown toad, about this big, answers to Trevor and also doesn't answer to Trevor. The girl blinked. You know him? Since he was 4, Harry said. I'll help. Lily, stay. The owl looked at him with magnificent indifference. Come on. He went out into the corridor. The girl, she introduced herself as Hermione Granger. Her parents were dentists, she'd read everything, she said this last part with a slight breathless emphasis that Harry recognized, had, he noted, already absorbed an impressive amount of material about the wizarding world for someone who had only recently discovered she was part of it. Did you really defeat you-know-who when you were a baby? She asked as they moved down the corridor. Something defeated him, Harry said. My mum's protection, mostly. I was 15 months old and significantly less useful than I am now. She looked at him. That's a very specific way to put it. It's accurate, he said. Most people say it differently. Most people weren't there, Harry said. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds and then said, that's a fair point actually, with the tone of someone revising an expectation upward. They found Neville 3 carriages down, crouched in the corridor with his hands hovering over Trevor's general area while Trevor demonstrated his complete indifference to being caught. Harry crouched down, moved his hands once, and Trevor relocated into his palms. Neville looked up. His face went through recognition and relief and delight in quick sequence. Harry, he said. Toad escaped again, Harry said. He always, how do you always, warm circle of proximity, Harry said. Works every time. Neville took Trevor back and held him with the practiced grip of long experience. He looked at Hermione and then at Harry. You know Hermione? We just met, Harry said. She's very good at finding things, Neville said. I noticed, Harry said. Hermione looked between them. You two know each other already. Since we were 7, Neville said. Harry taught me about the warm circle. The warm, later, Harry said. Come sit with us. The sorting was not what the castle's mythology suggested it would be, or rather, it was exactly what it was, which was a ceremony, and ceremonies were different from their legends. Harry sat in the great hall and looked at it clearly, the way Petunia had taught him to look at things, not what is this supposed to mean, but what is it actually doing and why. The house system was interesting in the same way that any sorting mechanism was interesting. It told you how an institution thought about people more than it told you about the people themselves. Brave here, clever there, loyal there, ambitious there, as though qualities were rooms you could be assigned to rather than currents running through a person simultaneously. He thought about Sirius, who had been the first black in Gryffindor in generations. He thought about his mother in Gryffindor and his father in Gryffindor, and he thought about Daphne, who would certainly be Slytherin, and thought about what it meant that those were different houses when the qualities involved, specifically, strategic thinking under pressure, genuine loyalty, and the particular courage of someone who acts rather than reacts, were not, in his experience, actually house exclusive. Potter, Harry. The hall went quiet. He walked to the stool and sat down and put the hat on, and it dropped over his eyes. The hall was dark. The hat spoke in his head, which was less surprising than it might have been since babbling had explained the mechanism. "Well," it said. "There you are." "Here I am," Harry agreed. "I've been waiting to sort you since your mother, you know. She was easier than you're going to be." "Why am I going to be hard?" "Because you have everything," the hat said. "Not talent, they all have talent. You have framework. You know what things are for. That's rarer." A pause. "Gryffindor wants you. So does Ravenclaw, and Slytherin has a fair argument. What do you think?" Harry asked. "I think," the hat said, "that you're the most honest person I've sorted in 40 years. Not honest as in truthful, honest as in consistent. What you are on the outside is what you are in here." Another pause, longer. "There's only one house that actually requires that." Harry waited. "Hufflepuff," the hat announced. The hall was briefly, genuinely surprised, not the malicious surprised of people who'd expected something else and were disappointed, but the honest surprised of people who hadn't considered it and were now rapidly reconsidering. Harry took the hat off. He walked to the Hufflepuff table and sat down, and a girl across from him said, "Hi. I'm Hannah," and a boy said, "That was brilliant, the hat's never been that long with someone," and someone else moved to make room and passed him a roll before the food had even appeared, and he thought, "Yes. This is right." He thought about the hat's logic. Consistent. He was consistent. He'd been consistently himself for 11 years in the face of considerable pressure to be something else, the symbol, the story, the boy who lived rather than the boy who was. And here was a house that valued the steady, unglamorous things, loyalty that lasted rather than loyalty that performed, hard work as a genuine expression of care rather than a means to distinction. He thought Petunia would have been Hufflepuff. He thought Lily might have been, under the surface of her Gryffindor. He thought he'd write and tell Daphne tonight and she'd say something precise and deflating about it and then something true. Hogwarts was, in its bones, extraordinary. Harry had expected this intellectually and now experienced it directly. The castle was alive in the way old things are alive, full of layer upon layer of accumulated intention, and he felt it through his ambient magic with the constant low-level awareness of someone in a place that resonated with everything he'd been learning for a decade. He also found it, practically speaking, a place with significant room for improvement. The defense against the dark arts classroom was being taught by Professor Quirrell, whom Harry assessed in the first lesson with the same careful attention he'd applied to everything in his life, and arrived at a set of conclusions that he filed carefully. Something was wrong with Quirrell. Not subtly wrong, wrong in a way that went underneath the surface, a quality Harry had been developing the sensitivity to notice since the dream started when he was 7. The scar prickled in Quirrell's presence, gently, just enough to register, and the ambient magic around Quirrell had a specific quality that Harry had learned to recognize as disturbance. He didn't raise this immediately. He filed it and watched. He also, in the first 2 weeks, established that the moving staircases had a logic he could map with moderate effort, that the Hufflepuff common room was exactly as warm as it should be and smelled of earth in a way he found completely comfortable, that Hannah Abbott was sharp and funny, that a boy named Justin Finch Fletchley was excellent at charms and didn't know it yet, that Neville had been sorted into Gryffindor and seemed cautiously happy about it, and that Hermione Granger was the most ferociously organized mind he'd encountered since Daphne. He wrote to Petunia every Sunday. He wrote to Daphne every Tuesday, which maintained the rhythm of their arrangement in a form that felt right. He wrote to Sirius with the two-way mirror when things needed immediacy, which he enjoyed partly for the content and partly because it meant he could see Sirius's face and confirm the ongoing project of Sirius's return to himself. He wrote one letter to Dumbledore in October, which was brief and specific. The defense position. Can we talk at Christmas? H.P. Dumbledore's response came the next morning. Yes. I've been waiting for you to notice. A.D. He found the corridor on a Thursday evening in November. Not by accident, he'd been mapping the third floor systematically, the same way he'd mapped Diagon Alley, because knowing the ground of your environment was basic practice. He found the locked door, noted it, noted the feeling through his scar as he stood near it, noted the specific quality of the magical protection around it. Something was in there. He went back to the Hufflepuff dormitory and thought about it. Whatever was being protected was significant. The level of enchantment around the corridor was not standard school security, it was layered and deliberate and had the specific quality of something intended to attract someone who was looking for it while deterring someone who wasn't. That asymmetry was interesting. He thought about Quirrell. He thought about the Scar's behavior. He thought about the conversation he and Petunia had had when he was 7, about cold thin feelings and something that was broken and putting itself back together. He wrote to Dumbledore again that night. Third floor corridor, East Wing. I think I know what's in there. I also think I know who's trying to get to it. The same issue as the defense position. H.P. The response came at breakfast. Come to my office Saturday morning. Bring what you know. A.D. He went on Saturday. He'd compiled his observations, the Scar's behavior in Quirrell's presence, the specific quality of the enchantments, Quirrell's inconsistency in lessons which he documented with dates and examples, the ambient disturbance he'd been tracking since September. He presented it to Dumbledore with the directness he applied to everything. Dumbledore listened without interrupting. When Harry finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Harry with the specific expression Harry had seen develop over 4 years of meetings, respect that had replaced expectation, the expression of someone who had planned for one thing and found another and was genuinely interested in what he'd found. You've been building this since September, Dumbledore said. Since my first lesson, Harry said. The scar is a reliable indicator. I've been calibrating it for 4 years. Dumbledore was quiet again. The object being protected is the Philosopher's Stone, he said. Nicholas Flamels. I moved it here believing it was safer than Gringotts. I may have miscalculated. Because whoever wants it knows it's here, Harry said. Yes. And the protections, while significant, are designed for deterrence rather than containment, Harry said. Which means they're planning to go through them. Dumbledore looked at him. I suspect that is correct. When? Harry said. Soon, Dumbledore said. There is something, a timetable I cannot fully see. But soon. He paused. Harry, I want to ask you something directly. Yes, Harry said. Are you frightened? Harry thought about this with his full honesty. A little, he said. Enough to be careful. Not enough to be stupid. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I've known something was coming since I was 7. I've been preparing since I was 7. I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared, the scar tells me exactly how real this is. But I'm not going to let it stop me thinking either. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. What do you need? He said. Information, Harry said. Specifically, what's past the locked door? All of it. The protections, the sequence, what's at the end. He paused. I work better with complete information. I always have. Dumbledore told him. Harry sat and listened and built the map in his head. It happened on a Tuesday in December, 3 days before the end of term. Harry had been monitoring Quirrell's behavior since October and had reached a point of sufficient certainty that he'd told Dumbledore 2 days prior that he thought it was imminent. Dumbledore had sent an owl that morning saying he needed to go to London on ministry business. which Harry thought was either genuine or a deliberate absence designed to see what happened, and he hadn't had time to determine which. He knew Quirrell was going for the stone when the scar moved from a background register to something acute and specific, at 9:30 in the evening, while Harry was in the Hufflepuff common room writing a letter to Petunia. He stopped writing. He sat for exactly 10 seconds, thinking it through. Then he stood up, told Hannah he'd be back later, ignored her concern, and went to the 3rd floor. The door was already open. He went through. The protections were exactly as Dumbledore had described them. Harry moved through each one with the specific focus of someone who has already solved these problems in theory and is now simply enacting the solutions. The Devil's Snare was no trouble. Herbology had been part of his education since Neville was 7 and had first brought a cutting to the Leaky Cauldron. The keys were a pattern problem which resolved quickly once he identified the right frame. The chessboard he moved across rather than through, along the edge where the pieces weren't, which the enchantment hadn't accounted for because it expected someone to play. The last room was Quirrell. He was standing before a mirror, large, ornate, with an inscription around the frame that Harry parsed in roughly 2 seconds and understood. He turned when Harry came in. "Potter," he said, and his voice was different now, the stutter entirely gone, which confirmed what Harry had suspected. Harry looked at him and looked at the mirror and looked at the back of Quirrell's head. "The stone's in the mirror," Harry said. "I know how it works. It only shows the stone to someone who wants to find it but not use it." Quirrell's face shifted. "Clever boy," he said, in a voice that wasn't entirely his. "He's not just in your head," Harry said. "He's on you. On the back of your head. That's the feeling I've been tracking since September." Quirrell stared at him. "I've been feeling him through my scar for 4 years, Harry said. "I know what his presence feels like. It's cold and thin and," he paused, "smaller than it used to be. He's not what he was. Not yet." He looked at the mirror. "He needs the stone to rebuild. And I'm not going to let him have it." He walked toward the mirror. "Stop him," said the voice from the back of Quirrell's head. Quirrell raised his wand. Harry did not raise a wand because he didn't have one, and because a wand was not what he was going to use. He'd been building constructs without a wand since he was 9. He'd been training with Babbling and Daphne for 2 years. He'd been living in an ambient magical field his entire life and he knew the architecture of this specific room, the enchantments, the layers, the specific resonance, because he'd been feeling it through his scar for 3 months. When Quirrell's binding spell came, Harry redirected it. Not with effort, with structure. The same way he'd demonstrated to Babbling at 9, the same principles he'd worked through with Daphne in 100 Thursday sessions. He took the structure of the incoming spell and deflected it along the wall, which it hit and dissipated, and then he stepped to the mirror and looked into it. He saw himself. He saw himself holding the stone. He felt the stone drop into his pocket. He stepped back from the mirror and looked at Quirrell, who was staring at him with an expression that was moving through disbelief toward fury. "Don't," Harry said. "You're 11 years old," the voice from Quirrell's head said. "Yes," Harry said. "I've been 11 for 5 months. I was 10 for the year before that, and 9 before that, and I've been preparing for this specific situation since I was 7. He held Quirrell's gaze steadily. "I know what you are and I know what you need and I know why you need it, and the answer is no. Whatever I have to do to make that no stick, I'll do it." The voice from the back of Quirrell's head was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "Show me what you can do, boy." Quirrell moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was, in the specific terms Petunia had used when they'd talked about conflict at 9 years old, strategic problem solving under conditions of genuine danger. Quirrell was competent. The presence sharing his body was more than competent. They had surprise, in the first 2 exchanges, of Harry's actual capability, and those 2 exchanges ended with Quirrell's spells deflected and Harry having moved twice to positions that were defensively better than where he'd been. The scar was burning. Not the gentle prickle of proximity, actual burning, the kind he hadn't felt since the worst of the dreams at 7, and he understood this was because the source was in the room with him. He didn't slow down. He used it the way he used everything, as information. Quirrell's next spell came high and lateral, and Harry redirected it into the mirror, which cracked, and the crack spread across the inscription, and something changed in the room. The enchantments destabilized slightly, and Harry felt it through his ambient awareness like a chord going out of tune. He pressed his hand to Quirrell's arm. This was the thing he'd thought about and decided on in the 30 seconds before entering the room. The touch between Lily's blood and the presence that had killed Lily. He didn't fully understand the mechanism. Babbling had theorized about it, but they hadn't been certain. He was certain now. Quirrell screamed. The presence in the room, he could feel it, cold and thin and furious and more afraid than it wanted to be, recoiled. Harry held on. His hand burned. The whole right side of his face was burning from the scar. He held on anyway. The mirror finished cracking. The room went white. He woke up in the hospital wing. The ceiling was white and the light was the specific quality of early morning, and he lay flat for a moment and did the methodical check of his own state, right hand sore but present, scar aching rather than burning, everything else functional. He sat up. Dumbledore was sitting in the chair beside the bed. "Good morning," Harry said. "Good morning," Dumbledore said. He looked at Harry with the expression he'd been developing over 5 years, respect, and something that went underneath respect, something older and less institutional. "How do you feel?" "Functional," Harry said. "The stone?" "Safe," Dumbledore said. "And will shortly be safer." He paused. "Quirrell is gone. The presence that was sharing him is gone as well. Not destroyed. Dispersed. Set back." He looked at Harry directly. "You knew the touch would work." "I theorized it," Harry said. "Babbling and I worked through the protective magic framework. Lily's sacrifice, the blood connection, the rebounded curse. We thought contact might be adversarial to him." He paused. "I was fairly confident." "Fairly confident," Dumbledore said. "I didn't want to be arrogant about it," Harry said. Dumbledore made a sound that was possibly a laugh. "You held on for 70 seconds while that was happening to your hand." "I needed it to work completely," Harry said. "Not just hurt him." A pause. "He'll come back," Harry said. "You know that." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "More directly next time. He'll have a body by then, probably, if he's patient, and he was patient before." Harry looked at the ceiling. "I've set him back." "That's useful. But it's not finished." "No," Dumbledore said. "It isn't." "I'd like to start preparing for the finished version," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "Not now," Harry said. "Not today. I'm going to write to Petunia and Sirius and eat something, probably in that order. But over the summer. I want to start understanding what a real confrontation looks like and what I need to develop to be ready for it." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'm not afraid of it. But I want to be ready." "Yes," Dumbledore said, and it was the quietest yes Harry had ever heard from him, the one stripped of all the layers he usually spoke in. He was discharged by lunch. He wrote the letters in order, Petunia first, then Sirius. He told them both accurately and without dramatization what had happened and what the outcome was, and that he was fine. He told Petunia the thing about the stone and the mirror and the mechanism of the touch. He told Sirius about holding on for 70 seconds, and Sirius's response via the mirror was immediate and was, 70 seconds. "You absolute," and then a laugh, and then your mother used to do exactly that, hold on longer than was strictly rational because she needed the thing to be completely done, and Harry sat with that for a while. He wrote to Daphne last. Used a construct to redirect 3 spells. Your Thursday training held up perfectly. Also, the scar is a better diagnostic tool than most wands. Tell no one I said the last part. Her response came 2 days later. I've already told Astoria. She sends her regards and says she knew you'd do something dramatic before the end of term. She's 7 and she's right, which is only slightly annoying. Come home. DG. On the last day of term, Neville came to find him in the Hufflepuff common room. He looked like someone who had been thinking about whether to come and had decided yes and wasn't fully at peace with the decision yet. I heard what happened, Neville said. Most people have, Harry said. I mean, Neville stopped. He sat down in the chair beside Harry and gathered his thoughts in the methodical way he developed since he was 7, the way of someone who had learned that his thoughts were worth the time to gather. I mean, I heard specifically. From someone who heard from someone. He looked at Harry. You did it alone. I did that part alone, Harry said. Getting to that part took 10 years and about 15 people. Neville thought about this. The stone is safe. Yes. Him. He's set back, Harry said. Not gone. Neville was quiet for a moment. I want to learn, Neville said. I mean, I know I'm learning here. But the other kind. The kind you do. He struggled for the frame, the thinking about what's actually happening kind. Harry looked at his friend. The boy from the back garden at the Leaky Cauldron, investigating plants and bringing cuttings in his handkerchief, who had grown into someone steady and capable and fundamentally decent in a way that Harry had enormous respect for. Come to the Leaky Cauldron this summer, Harry said. Tuesdays. Bring Trevor. Neville smiled. Platform 9 3/4 was grey and loud and smelled of steam and families. Harry stepped off the train and stood for a moment with Lily in her carrier and his trunk on the trolley and the noise of everyone around him, and he looked through the steam. Sirius first, taller than most of the platform, wearing robes that actually fit him now, the first time Harry had seen him in something that fit rather than the adjusted prison clothes or Remus's borrowed things. He was looking for Harry with the specific alertness of someone for whom finding the person was the only important thing currently happening. Petunia beside him. Her good coat. Her posture. The particular quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone passive but of someone who had arrived exactly where they intended to be and was waiting for the next thing with complete confidence in what it would be. Harry walked through the steam. Sirius saw him first and grinned, the full version, the one that was entirely his own, and moved forward, and Harry met him halfway and Sirius's hand landed on his shoulder briefly, solidly, the contact of someone who had lost the habit of physical presence and was carefully, deliberately rebuilding it. You were dramatic, Sirius said. It worked, Harry said. It did, Sirius agreed. Your mother's intervention. Your father's refusal to let go. He looked at Harry with the expression that Harry had been watching develop since March, the one that had started as helpless fondness and was becoming something that resembled, at its deepest point, pride. 70 seconds. The situation required it, Harry said. Obviously, Sirius said. He stepped back and Harry looked at Petunia. She looked at him for a moment with the complete, attending focus she had always given him, the kind that didn't perform and didn't sentimentalize and didn't diminish anything to make it easier to hold. Well, she said. Well, Harry said. Drafty old castle. Ancient magical institution. Famous for being impenetrable. In fairness, they didn't account for the specific combination of me and 10 years of your methodology. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved through several things and settled in a place that was, quietly and privately and exactly like Petunia, the closest thing to joy she wore in public. Right, she said. She picked up Lily's carrier because her hands needed something. Hungry? Starving, he said. Tom's made something. She turned. He always does. They walked off the platform together, Harry and Petunia and Sirius, with Remus falling into step beside them from somewhere he'd been watching quietly from, through the barrier, out into the noise and smell of ordinary London, the city that had no idea what walked through it on a Wednesday morning in December. Harry thought about the Leaky Cauldron. The room above the world. The bar where he'd learned things and argued about things and built, piece by careful piece, everything he actually was. He thought about a woman who had walked out of a house on Privet Drive at midnight in November with nothing but a sleeping infant and a decision. He thought about a door she'd opened and never closed. He thought he might spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. He thought he had a good shot. He grinned, and the November air came in cold and sharp around them, and they walked on.